I call to order the high-level panel discussion to brief on the situation of human rights in the Syrian Arab Republic, held pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 74/169 of 18th of December 2019. I warmly welcome all of you to this meeting. I would also like to welcome Ms. Ilse Brands-Keres, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and Head of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in New York, who will be moderating the panel discussion, along with the panelists who are joining the meeting virtually. We'll see them on the screen, and this is another try for the General Assembly to connect to the world when we are meeting in person. I'll make my statement from the rostrum. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, this high-level panel on the human rights situation in Syria marks a dark milestone for humankind. A decade of death, displacement, and destruction has left the Syrian people with little hope. Hundreds of thousands of people have been murdered. Aerial and artillery bombardments have reduced cities to rubble. More than half of the pre-conflict population is displaced. Starvation is used as a weapon of war. Humanitarian needs are increasing at a rate that existing capacities may not be able to meet. 1 in 8 children are underdeveloped due to malnutrition. An economic and unemployment crisis has led to 60% of Syrians living in extreme poverty, dealing with fuel shortages and power cuts in the midst of winter. Now, the plight of the Syrian people has been compounded by the parallel threat of COVID-19, where there is a critical need for vaccines for all. For many Syrians, social distancing is a luxury beyond the capacity of IDP camps. Even something as simple as hand washing is not always possible due to the disruption in water supplies. Those who contract the virus are unlikely to have access to treatment, and in previous year, half of all healthcare facilities were attacked, leading to a mass exodus of healthcare workers from Syria. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, the report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic, released last month, states, I quote, "The horrors of the conflict have left no Syrian family untouched. The Syrian people have endured being held under siege and suffered the effects of chemical weapons attacks. Recent reports document the killing, torture, and inhuman treatment of people in Syria, particularly of those deprived of their liberty. Family members of the detained and disappeared are consistently denied their right to information regarding the fate and whereabouts of their loved ones. Yet, impunity reigns for the perpetrators of these grave acts. The report of the Commission of Inquiry concludes that the violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in Syria are likely to constitute crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Furthermore, the root causes of the conflict, including human rights violations and abuses, remain unaddressed, and violators have not been held to account. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the Commission of Inquiry, and the international impartial and independent mechanism are working to bring about justice and accountability. Syrian civil society have been integral to these efforts and continue to demonstrate resolve and courage after 10 years of hardship. I am keen to hear the views and stories of our distinguished panelists today. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, 10 years on, the conflict in Syria and its effects are far from over. We may have become familiar with the images of death and destruction, but we must not become immune. We cannot ignore the suffering of the Syrian people. This is not a natural disaster. There is a human hand behind this catastrophe. If we are to uphold the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and ensure peace and security and the protection of the human rights of the people of Syria, we must pursue a permanent ceasefire. Humanitarian assistance must also reach the estimated 13 million Syrian people in need of assistance, 12.4 million of whom are experiencing the worst food security crisis in the history of the conflict. Of course, underpinning our shared hope for a sustainable solution and recovery is the political process. A Syrian-led, Syrian-owned political settlement, in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2254, is the best hope to ensure peace and stability in Syria and the protection of human rights of the people of Syria long denied them. It is the only way to meet the legitimate aspirations of all Syrians. We must all show our strong commitment to Syria's independence, unity, and territorial integrity, and support the process facilitated by the United Nations and the Special Envoy of the Secretary General in Geneva. I thank you. Before proceeding to the panel discussion, I would like to remind delegations that, as indicated in my letter dated 16th of February 2021, there is no pre-established list of speakers for this meeting. Delegations wishing to take the floor will be invited to press the microphone button on the console before them when the floor is opened. Delegations speaking on behalf of groups are invited to inform the Secretariat in order to be given priority in the speaking order. I now invite the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights to begin the high-level panel discussion.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for this timely discussion, which it is my honor to moderate. This month marks an extremely difficult anniversary. 10 years ago, in March 2011, Syria descended into one of the most devastating conflicts of the modern era. Civilians have borne the brunt of the effects of this conflict, and we see today a situation in which the realization of the most fundamental rights, from the right to life, to the right of adequate housing, to the right to health, particularly important in the midst of the current global pandemic, are impossible to realize for many Syrians. According to the World Food Programme, nearly 60% of the population in Syria is now food insecure. The COVID-19 pandemic, rising food prices, and the displacement and devastation of the economy by the decade-long conflict have created a situation in which families and vulnerable persons are unable to meet their basic needs. Against the backdrop of a worsening economic crisis, civilians across the country continue to suffer the direct and indirect consequences of armed conflict and violence. OHCHR continues to document the killing and injury of civilians by ground-based strikes, armed clashes, improvised explosive devices, including vehicle-borne IEDs used in populated areas, and explosive remnants of war. Civilians continue to face movement restrictions and displacement as a result of violence and conflict, and struggle to access desperately needed humanitarian assistance. Amidst dire conditions in Al-Hol and Roj camps, I wish to re-emphasize High Commissioner Bachelet's call to states to assume responsibility for all of their nationals in accordance with their obligations under international law. In 2020, 7 incidents resulted in the killing of at least 6 humanitarian aid or medical workers, including 1 woman, and the injury of 14 others as a result of air and ground-based strikes and IED attacks in northwest Syria. Targeted killings continue to be of serious concern. OHCHR has documented the targeting of humanitarian and healthcare personnel, as well as media workers by armed groups. Both government forces and non-state armed groups have continued to arbitrarily detain individuals, including women and children, humanitarian workers, and media professionals in areas under their effective control. In the majority of cases recorded by OHCHR, detainees were denied information about the reasons for their detention and other due process rights, while their families were denied information concerning the whereabouts or their fate, raising concerns that such detentions may constitute enforced disappearance. The conditions faced by tens of thousands of Syrians deprived of their liberty by both pro-government forces and non-state armed groups are dire. I want to emphasize that torture is absolutely prohibited under international law and cannot be justified under any circumstances. The families of those detained have the right to be informed of their fate and whereabouts and should be allowed to visit them. Human rights and humanitarian agencies must be granted access to all places where detainees and abductees are held. The impact of missing family members on those left behind is significant and devastating. The daily uncertainty, as well as the resulting socioeconomic struggles, particularly if the missing person was the family breadwinner, can create immense suffering for families. Families seeking truth and justice must be supported in this work. The establishment of an independent and impartial mechanism to address missing persons in Syria, as also called for by the Commission of Inquiry, could be a key step in addressing this critical issue. Amidst conflict and uncertainty, efforts continue to look for common ground and move towards a peaceful and just and sustainable future. In this context, I sincerely hope that there will be tangible progress by the Constitutional Committee with the voices and rights of Syrians, including young people and its civil society, at the center of this process. It is essential that international actors seek to bridge divides and put the needs of the Syrian people at the forefront. The engagement of civil society, especially women, will be essential to the success of the constitutional process in Syria. OHCHR seeks to support this work in a range of ways. Documentation of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, as well as monitoring human rights issues of concern, supports prevention efforts by the broader United Nations system. Effective accountability, justice, and remedies for the violations and crimes committed by all parties to the conflict will be an essential step in moving towards a sustainable peace in Syria. The work of mechanisms such as the Commission of Inquiry and the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism to assist in the investigation and prosecution of persons responsible for the most serious crimes under international law committed in the Syrian Arab Republic since March 2011, established by the General Assembly in its Resolution 71/248, is a key element towards accountability efforts. The Commission has, in the last weeks and days, released 2 reports, one of which looks closely at the critical issue of detention and arbitrary deprivation of liberty by all parties, also a priority concern for our office. OHCHR prioritizes supporting the work and amplifying the voices of civil society in Syria. Over the last decade of the conflict, civil society and the Syrian people have shown a strength and resilience that is beyond what should be asked of any human being. They continue to push for the realization of their rights, for life in peace and dignity, even as they face challenges most of us cannot imagine. Their commitment to this work is invaluable. The voices of Syrians and Syrian civil society organizations must be at the center of all efforts to improve the situation. The voices of victims, widows, refugees, youth, persons with disabilities, members of civil society groups, and many more must be at the core of efforts to build the future of their country. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes my statement on behalf of the OHCHR. Thank you. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I now have switched hats, and it is now my pleasure to proceed with the moderation of the panel. And I will now give the floor to our panelists. We have today with us Ms. Sabah Al-Halak, a legal and women's rights expert and the co-founder of the Syrian League for Citizenship. Sabah has been working on issues related to detention since the very beginning of the conflict, a situation that affected her own family too. Sabah spoke at the launch of the conference room paper of the Commission of Inquiry entitled "I Lost My Dignity: Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in the Syrian Arab Republic," and is also a member of the Women's Advisory Board and Constitutional Committee supported by the Office of the Special Envoy for Syria. Our second panelist, Ms. Wafa Mustafa, is a Syrian activist from Masayaf, Hama, who speaks the truth on the fate of her father, Ali Mustafa, reportedly arrested by state security services in Damascus in July 2013, whose whereabouts remain unknown to this date. Wafa took an active part in advocacy actions conducted by Families for Freedom, a group established in 2017 by Syrian women seeking truth and justice regarding their missing relatives, and she is now active in her individual capacity. Our third panelist, Mr. Mazen Darwish, heads the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, an NGO that serves as an umbrella for advocacy, documentation, and strategic litigation. SCM is notably involved in several universal jurisdiction cases in the EU pertaining to Syria, including the ongoing Koblenz trial in Germany, together with the Caesar Family Association of Victims, and a criminal complaint on the use of chemical weapons over the course of the conflict. And last, our fourth panelist, not least, we are very fortunate to be joined by Mr. Paulo Sergio Pinero, the chair of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic, who will deliver opening remarks on behalf of the Commission. And I also take the opportunity of welcoming Commissioner Hani Megali, who will participate in the discussion later on behalf of the Commission. And we also have with us Karen Abu Zaid today virtually. So I welcome all the panelists and look forward to a positive and productive discussion. I will give the floor first to Paulo Sergio Pinero, then to Sabah Al-Halak, then Wafa Mustafa, and Mazen Darwish to make their presentations. So please, Mr. Paulo Sergio Pinero, the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président de la...
Thank you, President of the General Assembly, Madam Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen.
On the cusp of the 10th green anniversary of the conflict at the Syrian Arab Republic. 1 decade in, it is abundantly clear that it is the children, women, and men of Syria who have paid the price when the Syrian government unleashed overwhelming violence to quell dissent. Opportunistic foreign funding, arms, and other support to the warring parties poured fuel on this fire that the world has been content to watch burn. Terrorist groups proliferated and inflicted their ideology on the people, preying particularly on women, girls, and boys, as well as ethnic and religious minorities and dissenting civilians. Pro-government forces have repeatedly targeted hospitals and medical facilities, decimating a medical sector prior to the arrival of the most catastrophic global pandemic in the century. The use of chemical weapons has been tolerated, the free flow of humanitarian aid instrumentalized, diverted, and hampered, even with Security Council authorization. Half the pre-war population has been displaced, many repeatedly. Numerous member states have intervened directly or indirectly, including through the imposition of unilateral sectoral sanctions that have worsened an already hobbled economy. There are basic human rights and humanitarian needs, food, water, healthcare, and education that must be met regardless of which entity controls a given territory. Warring parties' attempts to resolve the conflict militarily over the past decade have enabled the violation of nearly every core human rights. Parties to the conflict have cumulatively committed crimes against humanity and nearly every war crime applicable in a non-international armed conflict. Yesterday, we launched another report concluding that no warring party in Syria has respected the rights of detained persons. The government of Syria's forces arbitrarily arrested, tortured, and summarily executed detainees. In some instances, prisoners were raped. Other warring parties perpetrated similar war crimes in their detention facilities, with UN-designated terrorist organizations such as HTS and ISIL also engaging in crimes against humanity, while ISIL carried out a genocide against the Yazidis, in part through detention. Tens of thousands of people who were detained remain disappeared, many since nearly 10 years. The government on a massive scale, but also other parties on a smaller scale, are prolonging the suffering of hundreds of thousands of family members and loved ones by withholding information on their fate. This is a national trauma that must be addressed without delay. We urge the government and all other parties subjecting individuals to disappearances to take urgent, comprehensive steps to review the fates of those forcibly disappeared. Monsieur le Président,
Excellencies,
since the start of our mandate in 2011, these crimes, violations, and abuse documented are still happening now, as much as the world wants to look away. And despite the relative calm since last year's ceasefire, this war continues. The full human impact of this catastrophe will be felt for generations. Yet, through all of this, the rights and interests of regular Syrians have never been put first in this conflict. Though justice delay is just denied, justice must come, and it must come on all its forms. Victims' demands for justice and accountability are a central component of any durable peace. The restorative justice measures that Syrians have called for time and again cannot be relegated to a second tier of justice. More must be done to free the arbitrarily detained, locate and identify the missing, restore vital civil documentation, safeguard human rights in relation to housing, land and property, among other issues. The recent history of this very body, including the establishment of the III mechanism on Syria, shows the inaction of the UN Security Council need not prevent other initiatives. Efforts to ensure accountability for the crimes being committed are being addressed through the efforts of third state national judicial systems, most recently exemplified by the verdict handed down by a court in Koblenz, Germany last week. These efforts shows the determination of a few member states and the ingenuity of Syrian activists and victims to bring cases where they can. But it is an embarrassing indictment of both the parties to this conflict and the international community that these are the only criminal accountability avenues available after a decade of widely known abuse. Excellence, as Dag Hammarskjöld famously said, the United Nations, quote, was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell, end of quote. The entire UN system has by now produced an immensely vast body of reports, briefings, and speeches about the Syrian conflict and the litany of violations and abuses imposed on civilians, including our reports. I invited the representatives of the member states to examine this body of documentation detailing just a fraction of the suffering of Syrians and to ask whether it has done so for the people of Syria. As we speak, millions of Syrian civilians live in internal displacement with limited access to basic human necessities, in cities reduced to rubble, subject to predation by a constellation of armed actors, while the international community deters. It is far past time to finally put Syrians first and expend every effort to support a peaceful, negotiated resolution to the conflict and to help place Syria on a path toward a stable, prosperous, and just future for all her people. Merci, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pinero. Now we go on to our second panelist, who is Ms. Sabah Al-Halak. So please, the floor is yours.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank previous speakers. They're full aware of the situation in Syria. So I will be brief in order not to repeat what has already been said. Allow me to thank the OHCHR and all of those who supported our participation in this panel to convey to you the voices of Syrian men and women. 6 years have passed since the adoption of Resolution 2254, and 21 years have passed since the adoption of Resolution 1325. Have they been implemented, and to what extent are they binding to member states of the United Nations? I am a Syrian woman. I have been a women's activist for 30 years. The violations against Syrian women and girls that we've seen since 2011 cannot be summarized in a few words. You all know how women's bodies are used as a tool of war by parties of any conflict. Imagine the situation of Syrian women who have been deprived for a long time of legal protection from all forms of violence. whether domestic violence or violence by the regime and armed groups. And I'm not excluding anybody. We have seen violations against men and women since the outbreak of the revolution in March 2011. But we believe that violence against women is particularly and excruciatingly painful, as these crimes led to more crimes. Raped women are being killed by their families under the pretext of protecting their honor. Survivors are being stigmatized by their families and communities. It is the survivors that pay the price of being raped. So the Syrian context requires different mechanisms to deal with this issue, especially as the legal, political, cultural, and social environment contributes to entrenching violence against women. It is a patriarchal mentality given legitimacy in Syrian law. Ladies and gentlemen, you are all aware that thousands of activists have been detained, tortured, and prevented from traveling. Women providing relief services have not been spared either. Women have been subjected to all forms of violence, including child marriage, forced marriage, rape, trafficking, and being sold in ISIL's slave markets. The economic, political, and humanitarian situation today in Syria is even more complex due to the ongoing conflict and the COVID-19 pandemic. It is known to all that women are disproportionately affected. They are the poorest. They are the ones who are economically, politically, and socially marginalized. Now the question is, what are the decisions that the United Nations has taken to support and protect them, especially in the different areas inside Syria? Today, the political process is at a standstill. There is no movement in negotiations and perhaps even in the constitutional process. You all know that the Syrian file is not in the hands of the Syrian people. It is in the hands of a number of UN member states. So what is your role in stopping the suffering and the bloodshed in Syria? I am a Syrian refugee in Lebanon. Allow me to speak about the situation of refugees in Syria. Mr. Pinero has referred to their situation. Syrian refugees have been living in dire conditions, partly due to the policies of host countries towards them, especially in Lebanon. On the 14th of July 2020, the Lebanese government adopted a general policy on the return of refugees to Syria. This paper does not address protection. It does state that Syrians can come back and visit Lebanon, although not immediately after they leave. In reality, they're not allowed to go back. The policy states that 89% of Syrians want to go back, according to the UNHCR, but it overlooks the fact that 85 to 88% of Syrians don't consider the political and security conditions to be ripe for their return, although they do want to return. This policy refers to the principle of non-refoulement, but we need to remember that between the 21st of May and the 28th of August 2019, 3,000 refugees were forcibly returned to Syria. Thousands of Syrians were not allowed to go back to Lebanon. The situation today is extremely precarious due to lockdown measures to curb the spread of COVID-19. And it is especially difficult for women who are subjected to more violence and face poverty. And the question is, does it suffice to state that Syria is not a safe place, or does the situation require taking practical steps to protect refugees from being forcibly returned and exercising pressure on governments that favor their deportation? Ladies and gentlemen, the dossier of detainees and missed persons is a humanitarian dossier. All parties are guilty of detentions and forced disappearances, especially the Syrian government, the member of the United Nations. The humanitarian file should not be contingent upon progress made in negotiations, the constitutional process, or an Astana process. We must take action now, especially in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Syrian and international civil society has already provided so much evidence. The reports of the International Commission of Inquiry, the report called I Lost My Dignity, which documented thousands of violations against Syrian women by all parties, the Caesar photographs. What other facts are needed for the global conscience to be awakened to help tens of thousands of detainees whose fate remains unknown to their families and to us, human rights activists? We demand, and this is our right, we do not call for, we do not recommend, we're not using diplomatic language here. We demand the following. You must take a decisive humanitarian stance, regardless of your positions towards the parties to the conflict, to alleviate the tragedies that Syrians have been enduring for more than 50 years and that have become even more unbearable since 2011. This stance should lead to binding, practical decisions to release all prisoners of opinion and to clarify the fate of those who disappeared. You must bring pressure to bear on countries with influence on the Syrian issue to implement Security Council resolutions, especially Resolution 2254, and to revive the constitutional and political process. You must ensure the protection of refugees in host countries. It is part of your responsibility to guarantee that they return to their places of origin in a dignified and voluntary manner according to the International Convention on Refugees. Female refugees, displaced women, widows, and women breadwinners must be provided housing for them and their children. Pressure must be brought to bear on the negotiating parties and on countries sponsoring the Syrian political process to ensure the implementation of gender-sensitive transitional justice programs that refer those who use violence against women, especially sexual violence, to special courts. In closing, Syrian men and women all around the world, in Syria and in host countries, need you to act now to alleviate their economic and humanitarian hardship, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Syrian government continues to detain activists only because they're criticizing government's policies that are not fit to address the deteriorating living conditions. 83% of Syrians live now under the poverty line. Your support and the practical steps you take, your deeds and not your words, are the only way for Syrians to regain their trust in their international community and the United Nations, to hold on to their hope of a decent life, to believe that you have been truly defending human rights over the past 10 years, since the beginning of our revolution. It is a revolution of a people that aspires to realize its rights to freedom, equality, and participation, and to build a country of citizenship where everybody lives in dignity. Thank you for your attention. We are awaiting your practical steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Al-Halak. Now I give the floor to Ms. Wafa Mustafa. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to address the UN General Assembly. My name is Wafa Ali Mustafa, and I have not heard from my father Ali Mustafa now for 2,801 days. Almost 8 years ago, when he was forcibly disappeared by the Syrian regime. My father is a human rights defender who protested against injustice and oppression in our country, and he raised me to do the same. My mom, 2 sisters, and me have never been told why he was taken from us or where he is being held. We just don't know. I have campaigned and still campaign every day for his freedom alongside so many other families missing their loved ones. Last summer, I graduated from university in Germany. It was a difficult moment, and I wished my father was here, as my education has always been so important to him. Sometimes I cry for hours and think everything I do is pointless. I wondered this morning, is there a point in addressing all of you today? All Syrians do wonder. But I am sure this is what my dad wants me to do. And I know that if he is released, he will ask me what I have been doing all this time for him and for Syria's 130,000 detainees. He will ask what we have all been doing. I myself was detained at the age of 21 for daring to dream of a free and just Syria. I am 30 now, and I have spent the 10 years since my release demanding justice against the Assad regime and other groups who continue to use detention as a weapon of war. When I think of the young women I left behind in prison, I wonder if they ever saw freedom again. I fear what they went through in those cells where women are systematically raped and tortured. You have all seen Caesar photos of the inhuman conditions inside Assad's cells. Photos of bodies scarred by torture and starvation, all documented by a state apparatus of terror designed to silence opposition. I am horrified to imagine what COVID-19 is doing to the destroyed immune system of detainees still inside the regime's detention centers, which are breeding conditions, breeding grounds for illnesses and viruses. It's why I continue to urge all states which welcome the refugees to stop any forced return. You know, civilians will not be returning home. They will be returning to Assad's torture dungeons. When you speak about things like detention, torture, and atrocities for 10 years, suddenly normal things like childhood and life before the revolution become harder to recall. That's why I carry my father's picture. I fear that we only exist if we are remembered. It's why I took photos of him and 120 other detainees to the courthouse of the first trial against officials in Assad's torture regime in Koblenz, Germany. As families, we are deeply frustrated by the UN's collective failure to address these atrocities at the International Criminal Court. It should be Assad himself on trial. Last month, families and victims launched a charter for truth and justice to once again demand urgent action from this forum. It's a victim-centered roadmap that you can all follow to fulfill the demands of victims of unlawful arrest, enforced disappearance, and torture, for the immediate release of detainees and a halt to inhuman treatment and gender and sexual-based violence. While we continue to seek accountability for crimes against humanity, justice for Syria has to begin with the release of all detainees and an end to the use of unlawful detention and enforced disappearance as a weapon to silence and terrorize communities. If we all agree on this, then urgent action needs to be taken now to release all detainees, not as prisoner exchanges arranged between military sites, but as part of a comprehensive solution to these crimes. Our plight is urgent. This assembly has turned a blind eye to children suffocating under the rubble of their own homes. Their families have not. Now, you are turning a blind eye to young women and men being snatched from their families in Syria. Their families will not. They have even endured the pain of searching through photos of tortured bodies for answers. Assad Syria is a torture state enabled by some members of this assembly, but it will become my home again. As Syrians, we have been through horrific things, but we do not give up on fighting for our freedom. Who am I to say there is no hope? Who are you to say that? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mustafa. And now I give the floor to our last panelist, Mr. Mazen Darwish. Please, Mr. Darwish, the floor is yours.
السيد رئيس الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة فولكان بوسكير المحترم.
President of the General Assembly, Volkan Bozkir, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Madame Kirs, ladies and gentlemen, I would have liked to see Yahya Ashabazi in my place here today. He's a young Syrian who's understood the principle of a tolerant Islam, open to other people, an Islam that rejects violence. I would have liked Khalil Martouk to be in my place. He's a Syrian lawyer who taught me that justice is a moral value and that first and foremost we need to, in the name of this justice, defend all victims regardless of their religion, race, colour or gender. I would have liked to be here in my place Mashal Atemu, a Syrian politician who taught me that full and equal citizenship between the children of the same nation is the only guarantee of the unity of nations, cohesion and the protection of their social fabric. Where that moral backdrop is speaking, many Syrians have tried to find a moral, patriotic alternative, one that is not wedded to the oppressive terrorist regime. My colleague, lawyer Razan Zaitouna, and the doctor Aham Zazul have defended these notions. The last of these people was arrested on the 16th of February 2012. He died later in a prison as a victim of torture and because he was deprived of health care. His photo was later published among the photos that were disseminated by the noble military photographer César. After the arrest of the aforementioned people and after the death of Dayam as a result of torture, Razam Dayton tried to flee the security services. He tried to go to Eastern Ghouta so that this person could continue to document human rights abuses. This person was later arrested with a group of colleagues by an armed group. She was disappeared by a faction. On the 9th of December 2013, her whereabouts remained unknown, as is that of other colleagues. To date, the mother of Ghazan has been looking for information about her daughter and the fate of her and her colleagues. The mother of Dayam wants her offspring to be buried. Ladies and gentlemen, stories of these people are stories of the Syrian revolution. They are the stories of millions of people who dream of change and who work using peaceful means and with exceptional valor to ensure dignity, freedom and justice for all Syrians. Syrian authorities have responded to these dreams through violence, oppression, torture, and this to safeguard their gains. And they've showed blatant disregard for these Syrian national interests. Certain human rights defenders and Syrians have been forced to take up arms to defend themselves and their families. And many members of the military have actually defected instead of respecting orders that have nothing to do with the oath they took when they entered the military. That's a natural reaction, of course, but a group of opportunists found an opportunity in that gesture to take advantage of the dreams of these young people and to take advantage of their enthusiasm in the name of their vision of freedom. They tried to collect the funds of ISIS and ISIL. ISIS and ISIL and Al-Qaeda have found a fertile breeding ground for their terrorist ideals and to impose an abject model of values by force in the name of their economic interests. National interests are complex and, of course, are all intertwined with Syrians' geopolitical interests. Regional and international powers rallied to ensure that their interests could prevail in this situation. And so we found ourselves at the crossroads that we know today. We're all very aware of that crossroads, and a number of member states of this General Assembly have contributed to bringing us there. Ladies and gentlemen, 10 years have elapsed since the beginning of the Syrian conflicts. Here is the toll. We've had tens of thousands of detained and disappeared persons, thousands of deaths, the total destruction of cities and towns, millions of children deprived of education, thousands of displaced persons, many people suffering from cold, illness, witnessing the destruction of their infrastructures, a collapsed economy, a devalued national currency, a country divided that has 5 armies from the Golan to the northeast and the northwest and through Damascus. These 5 armies reign. There's an international community and UN institutions that are powerless. We're witnessing a collapse of the human rights system. Who's won? That's the question. I would have liked to bring to you good news, particularly to those that believed in military solutions. Unfortunately, the only news I have for you is that everybody has lost. You and all parties to this conflict, you are defeated. All Syrians, without any exceptions whatsoever, are the losers. The majority of these Syrian people are, in one way or another, victims, with the exception of certain leaders that shoulder responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity that were perpetrated by the Syrian regime. This responsibility needs to be shouldered. There's no virtue in war unless it ends. If this war continues, Syria will become a failed state. The suffering of millions of Syrians will continue, but there will also be consequences for international peace and security, more serious consequences than those we're seeing today. Either we are all saved or we are ultimately doomed as one people. As a Syrian citizen, I call upon Syrian citizens to have a national ceasefire and to impose that upon all parties to the conflict. There needs to be an urgent meeting convened under the aegis of the UNSG, one which brings together all states concerned by the Syrian conflict to draw up a roadmap, and this in order to implement Resolution 2254 in its entirety. All mechanisms have proved worthless to date, so this resolution needs to be implemented. The Security Council needs to urgently convene a meeting to ensure that parties to the conflict do the following. In the form of a binding resolution, there needs to be an end to the implementation of the death penalty. There needs to be a moratorium on the death penalty and all death warrants until new ordinance. There needs to be a list of official detention sites and non-official detention sites. The ICRC and the UNHCR must be allowed to inspect these detention sites and to ensure that all detainees are held in accordance with the Mandela rules. The UNHCR must have lists of all detainees, where they're detained, their charges, and if they have died since their detention. All those that have been arbitrarily detained must be released according to humanitarian criteria. First and foremost, children, women, sick people, and elderly persons. There needs to be an international team established to inspect burial grounds and to preserve DNA samples. Samples need to be, and remains rather, need to be given back to families so that they can be buried with dignity according to the rights respected by their loved ones. Ladies and gentlemen, today a group of victims of the chemical attack in eastern Ghouta on the 21st of August 2013 have lodged a complaint in France. The path to international justice has been full of obstacles due to the Russian Federation's use of the veto. We are aware that these initiatives ultimately will not allow us to achieve justice that the Syrians hope for. But we can't talk about justice, transitional justice that is, without ensuring a political transition. And we can't talk about the past at a time when the human rights violations and crimes continue. These violations are a message to the international community and should send a message to the international community. And this message is the following: there cannot be lasting peace in Syria without transitional justice. Any attempt to achieve a political agreement which guarantees the interests of warlords, disregarding the grievances of victims that simply want justice, will ultimately only lead to a new war for revenge. It is impossible to contemplate the voluntary, safe return of Syrian refugees without legal guarantees that guarantee that these violations will not occur again. These violations that prompted them to leave. It's vital that those responsible for these violations are held accountable. They need to be forbidden from entering public office. Security service need to be reformed, as do their privileges and prerogatives. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to talk to the children of my homeland, Syria, from this lofty rostrum. Syrians, Muslims, Christians, Alawite, Yazidis, whatever creed you are, Turkmens, Syrians of all creeds, beliefs and faiths. Many people are on this earth, from South Africa to Rwanda, from Spain to Chile. Many people across this globe have been able to overcome their grief, to bandage their wounds and to think of a prosperous future. We're capable of just that. We are children of an age-old civilization. We're proud of being Syrian. We have invented the alphabet, music, and many other creative arts. We can dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Darwish. And with this, we have concluded the introductory remarks by the panel, and I thank you for your initial presentations. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and our distinguished panelists for their contributions to the discussions. I now open the floor for a first round of comments and questions. As mentioned earlier, there is no established list of speakers. Delegations wishing to take the floor are invited to press the microphone button, and delegations speaking on behalf of groups are invited to approach the list of speakers table and will be given priority. In order to hear as many speakers as possible within the limited time available for this meeting, may I request delegations to make their interventions concise and not longer than 5 minutes for delegations speaking on behalf of a group of states and 3 minutes for statements by individual member states. I thank you for your cooperation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States, and I wish all the best during the Security Council presidency this month. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And let me start, Mr. President, by thanking you for convening today's meeting. We welcome the presentations from the UN Commission of Inquiry and from Syrian civil society, which reflects the Commission's exceptional work alongside brave Syrian human rights defenders who, despite grave risks, continue to document atrocities and press for accountability. We also appreciate the work of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and welcome the Assistant Secretary General's participation. And most of all, I want to thank Mazen Darwish, Wafa Mustafa, and Sabe al-Halak for being here today and for your tireless efforts to press for human rights in Syria. You really are heroes, and it is incredibly important that we hear from credible voices on the ground. This month marks a full decade of untold suffering at the hands of the Assad regime. How tragic that this is the first time in those 10 years that the General Assembly will finally hear directly from Syrian survivors and the Commission of Inquiry about these appalling atrocities. Atrocities so terrible that some of them, as the Commission of Inquiry has made clear, rise to the level of war crimes and crimes against humanity. I want to address three aspects of the Assad regime's brutality: the detention centers, the use of chemical weapons and violence against innocent citizens, and the disruption of humanitarian aid. First, the Assad regime continues to imprison tens of thousands of innocent Syrians, women and children, the elderly, doctors, aid providers, journalists, human rights defenders. These innocent civilians are denied fair trials. They're subject to torture, sexual violence, and inhuman conditions, and many are at grave risk of being exposed to COVID-19. At least 14,000 Syrians have been reportedly tortured and tens of thousands forcibly disappeared. We demand that the status of all those detained be made public, and we demand that the bodies of the deceased be returned to their loved ones with the time, place, and cause of death. Second, the Assad regime has deployed chemical weapons against its own citizens. They have slaughtered peaceful protesters and destroyed civilian facilities throughout Syria, devastating numerous hospitals and homes. Approximately 12 million people, almost half of the pre-war population, have fled their homes and are now internally displaced or refugees. And third, the United States condemned the closure of Bab al-Salam and al-Yarabia border crossings. These closures prevented vital humanitarian aid by the United Nations, and it is simply deplorable. And it has unnecessarily deepened the sufferings of millions of Syrians. 10 years ago, peaceful protesters stood up for themselves and for democracy. The Assad regime responded with snipers and tanks, has dropped barrel bombs and chemical weapons, blocked humanitarian aid in its Starve and Surrender campaign, and systematically detained and tortured tens of thousands. And yet, as our guests exemplified today, the Syrian people have persisted. We cannot let their persistence be in vain. So the United States stands with the Syrian people, Syrian civil society, and a wide group of international partners in demanding accountability and supporting a political solution as set out in UN Security Council Resolution 2254. And we cannot emphasize enough the role of Syrian women in this process and the importance of implementing Resolution 1325 and the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. It is time for the Syrian people, especially Syrian women, to be heard. And it is time for us to reach a real political solution. This is the only way to bring sustainable peace, stability, and security to the Syrian people. With that, I'd like to end by asking a question to the panel. How can the international community better support former detainees and other survivors of the regime's atrocities? And what can we do to help that we aren't doing now? Let's endeavor to answer these questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank you for organizing this meeting. I also would like to thank the panelists for their briefings. Mr. President, I would like to take a moment to reflect upon the background of this important and timely meeting. 10 years ago, on March 15th, the Syrian people stood up peacefully against dictatorship and oppression. They paid a heavy price in their quest for freedom and dignity, suffered unthinkable agony. Hundreds of thousands have been killed by the regime and its supporters. Tens of thousands have disappeared. Millions have been displaced. The survivors endure multifaceted hardships. They live, on one hand, under constant threat of imminent attacks from the regime and terrorist organizations. On the other hand, they struggle to live in a country in ruins without a glimpse of hope for the future. They are freezing and starving. They are traumatized. Several UN reports reveal that the acts of the regime amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Stephen Rapp, who served as prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone before, stated that it is the biggest volume of documents since Nuremberg trials. The Syrian regime's atrocities and crimes against its own people came in many different forms over the past decade, such as aerial bombings of all kinds, including prohibited cluster and incendiary bombs and chemical weapons, psychological and physical torture of the opponents and their family members, including women and children, arbitrary detention and abductions, sexual abuse, long-term sieges without access to any humanitarian or medical assistance. Mr. President, it's our legal and moral duty to protect Syrian civilians against the regime's grave atrocities and hold those who are responsible for the crimes against humanity accountable. There will be no lasting peace without accountability and transitional justice. This is how we can prevent the reoccurrence of such crimes in the future. A genuine political transition and a new Syria can only be built on the sound basis of a closure and the feeling that justice is served. The Commission of Inquiry, OPCW, and the IIIM and have a vital role in ensuring that impunity does not take root in the post-conflict Syria and the crimes will not go unpunished. Turkey supports and cooperates closely with these bodies towards ensuring accountability for the serious crimes committed by the Syrian regime. The recent landmark decision of the Koblenz court in Germany, sentencing a former intelligence agent of the Syrian regime to 4.5 years in prison on charges of aiding and abetting crimes against humanity, is an important step in the right direction. Mr. President, it is clear that Syria remains first and foremost a serious protection crisis. The responsibility of the international community to protect failed big in Syria. In 2019, we witnessed a relentless military campaign in Idlib under the pretext of combating terrorism, which led to unprecedented levels of displacement along our borders. Due to the March 5th ceasefire agreement, we have been successful in averting the worst humanitarian disaster of the 21st century. However, the regime continues its violations and the crisis is getting worse with attacks combined with the spread of COVID-19 and harsh winter conditions. While we exert efforts to preserve the ceasefire, we also continue our fight against terrorism without hesitation. As the only NATO country that engaged in chest-to-chest combat against Daesh, we have eliminated more than 4,000 Daesh terrorists in Syria. We will not tolerate any terrorist organization to find safe haven right on the other side of our borders. The separatist agenda, attacks and human rights violations by terrorist organization PKK-YPG and the Syrian offshoot, the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, merit the same level of attention by the international community. There has been growing evidence in northern Syria about PKK-YPG's human rights violations, such as recruiting child soldiers, intimidating dissidents, demographic engineering, and forced conscription in areas under its control. Children are deprived of their right to education as this brutal terrorist group arrests hundreds of teachers who oppose their ideological curricula. Turkey will continue its efforts to maintain de-escalation on the ground, to vigorously support initiatives for accountability in Syria, to advance the political process through the constitutional community, and to achieve a political settlement in accordance with the Security Council Resolution 2254. Mr. President, my country continues to host 4 million Syrians as a result of the regime's search for a military solution. This corresponds to 1/5 of the entire population of Syria before the start of the conflict. Together with 5 million Syrians living immediately next to our borders, we provide protection and care to 9 million Syrian people. The international community cannot turn its back on this tragedy and leave it only on our shoulders. 3 million people in the Northwest rely entirely on lifeline UN cross-border operations conducted from Turkey by the UN. The mechanism is also the sole instrument for the UN to channel COVID-19 vaccines to the most vulnerable in the region. I reiterate the call of the General Assembly through its Resolution 75/193 on the human rights situation in Syria and urge the Security Council to fulfill its responsibility to enable the continuation of UN cross-border humanitarian operations beyond July 2021. I also wish to remind the urgent need to consider additional crossing points in order to enable the UN to reach those in need through the most direct routes. This is not a political matter, it is a humanitarian urgency. So be courageous and extend your helping hand to the Syrian people. Mr. President, throughout the conflict in Syria, civil society has been playing an important role in revealing the gross human rights violations and raising the legitimate aspirations of the people. They constitute the main agents for documenting the most serious crimes committed by the regime. They also play a life-saving role as first responders during regime's brutal attacks. It is incumbent upon us to address their requests and give more space to their voices so that they can define their own destiny. Syrians deserve our collective action, and Turkey will continue to do its utmost to bring peace and justice to the brave Syrian men and women who have suffered too much for too long. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Thank you. Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries, the Republic of North Macedonia, Montenegro and Albania, the country of the Stabilization and Association Process and potential candidate Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as the Republic of Moldova and Georgia, align themselves with this statement. The countries of Andorra, Monaco and San Marino also align with this statement. Mr. President, the European Union welcomes this timely high-level panel of the General Assembly on the situation of human rights in Syria, and allow me to thank the panelists for their contributions. Mr. President, as many have recalled before me, later this month on the 15th of March 2021, we will commemorate a somber anniversary. The Syrian conflict will have lasted 10 years. Yet, even after a decade of conflict, the violence and instability in Syria continue to cause enormous suffering with long-term consequences for the Syrian people. The human devastation of the country endures. The dire human rights and humanitarian situation in Syria calls for the continuous full attention of the UN human rights bodies. The EU condemns the persistent, widespread, systematic and serious violation and abuses of human rights and all violations of international humanitarian law by all parties to the conflict, but in particular by the Syrian regime and its allies. Therefore, the EU continues to call upon all parties, in particular the Syrian regime and its allies, to fully respect their obligation under international humanitarian law and to permanently cease indiscriminate airstrikes and shellings on civilians and civilian objects and critical infrastructures such as health facilities and schools, and to protect those most vulnerable, as well as health and humanitarian workers. The EU also reiterates its call for a complete, immediate and nationwide ceasefire throughout Syria, in line with the call by the Secretary General, by his Special Envoy, and in compliance with Security Council resolutions, to guarantee the protection of civilians on the ground and from airstrikes. As the largest humanitarian donor across the whole of Syria, the EU reiterates the need for safe, full, unhindered, and sustained humanitarian access, including to places of confinement or detention, in line with the humanitarian principles. In this respect, we echo the call by the Secretary General for improved humanitarian access, both cross-line and cross-border. The same access must be ensured for protection and human rights organizations. The regime continues to impose administrative and security restrictions on humanitarian access, especially in areas previously held by the Syrian opposition, while the continued harassment and enforced disappearance of current and former humanitarian workers, activists, and other civilians is deeply concerning. All such practices must cease immediately. All those responsible for breaches of international humanitarian law and human rights law, some of which may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity, must be held accountable. The EU reiterates its call to have the situation in Syria referred to the International Criminal Court. In the meantime, in the absence of avenues for international justice, the prosecution of war crimes under national jurisdiction to denounce the responsibility for human rights violations of Syria and all parties to the conflict represents an important contribution towards securing justice. In this regard, the recent ruling of a German regional court where a defendant has been found guilty and sentenced for his role in the Syrian state torture regime is an encouraging step forward. The EU has supported and will continue to support efforts to gather evidence with a view to future legal action, including by the International, Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria and the Commission of Inquiry. Regarding the situation of refugees and of internally displaced persons, the EU continues to voice strong concern about reports of social and demographic engineering in areas throughout Syria and mass waves of displacement inter alia in parts of the northwest and northeast. The EU insists that the return of refugees and internally displaced persons to their places of origin can only be encouraged if it can take place in a safe, voluntary and dignified manner, in line with the parameters defined by UNHCR and in accordance with international law. The underlying causes of the refugees and displacement crisis must be addressed through the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254. The EU remains committed to the unity, sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Syrian state and recalls that any sustainable solution to the conflict requires a genuine political transition in line with Security Council Resolution 2254 and the 2012 Geneva Communiqué negotiated by the Syrian parties within the UN-led Geneva process. The EU reiterates that all elements of Security Council Resolution 2254 must be implemented, including the issues of detainees and missing persons, and the establishment of a safe and neutral environment in order for free and fair elections to be held under UN supervision. The EU, in line with EU Council conclusions, will be ready to assist in the reconstruction of Syria only when a comprehensive, genuine and inclusive political transition in the framework of Security Council Resolution 2254 and the Geneva process is firmly underway. In closing, Mr. President, allow me to draw your attention to the 5th Brussels Conference on the Future of Syria and the region, which will take place on the 30th of March, which we have the pleasure to co-host with the United Nations. The conference aims to consolidate international support for urgent progress towards a political solution to the conflict in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. It aims also to mobilize international financial support to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people in Syria and in the region, and to support Syria's neighbors and hosting communities. The conference will provide a unique platform for interaction between policymakers and civil society that has been playing a crucial role in shedding the light on the human rights violations in Syria during the years of the conflict. We will also use the conference, Mr. President, to stress the importance of progress on other parts of the Security Council Resolution 2254, such as detainees and missing persons, and highlight the demand for safe and unhindered humanitarian access and the crucial need to renew and broaden the cross-border resolution in the Security Council in July, which preserves a vital lifeline into northern Syria. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President, for putting this subject on the agenda. I would also like to thank ASG Kiris to have put together this very impressive panel, and I would like to thank the panelists for their very sobering, deeply saddening testimony of the present situation in Syria. The debate, Mr. President, is very timely, as we were reminded by our Turkish colleague. It is 10 years ago that the ordinary people in Syria took to the streets and asked for reforms and change. They exercised their right to peaceful assembly to the freedom of speech, for the respect for their civil and political rights, their economic, social, and cultural rights. How did the Syrian regime react? Instead of responding to the request of the people, to the aspiration of the many young people in Syrian society, they became more oppressive, more violent, exercised torture, indiscriminate detention, forced disappearance, physical and sexual violence. And we heard from Sabah Halak the testimony about the fact that the Syrian crisis has affected, in particular, women. We have seen murder by the regime. We have seen violations of international humanitarian law, violation of international human rights law. We have seen violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And the Caesar photos have shown how far human beings, or one must say human beasts, are ready to go. These are incredible pictures. Wafa Mustafa, in her statement about the Assad state, also the other briefer, reminded us that this state was the cradle of civilization, the cradle of the alphabet. This state has become a torture state. The responsibility squarely lies with the regime and with those countries that support the regime. How do we get out of this? How do we get the many refugees? We heard about the 4 million refugees in Turkey. My country, Germany, hosts at least 1 million of Syrian refugees. How can they go back in a dignified way according to the parameters by the UNHCR? We need a political solution. But this political solution can only be reached if the godfathers of the Assad regime, if Russia in particular, put pressure on the regime to agree to a political solution, which is a real solution. We need humanitarian aid to go in. It is, as many speakers before have already mentioned it was inhumane that Russia and China in the Security Council vetoed humanitarian aid to come into the country to help the suffering people, women and children. And we need accountability. Many of you have said that reconciliation in Syria will only be possible with accountability. And there is a long list of examples. Somebody mentioned this from the Nuremberg trials, I would say, until to the system that we have in place in Colombia. It was very disappointing. It remains very disappointing that Russia blocked the International Criminal Court to look at the crimes and look for accountability and prepare the ground for reconciliation. But last week's ruling of the higher regional court in Koblenz, which convicted a former Syrian regime official for aiding and abetting crimes against humanity in connection with torture in Syrian regime prisons, is historic and an important first step towards justice and accountability. The verdict sends a very clear message. Whoever commits crimes against humanity or war crimes cannot feel safe anywhere and will eventually be held accountable. This decision is also a symbol of hope for the tens of thousands who have been victims of torture and have suffered at the hands of the Syrian regime. We heard the testimony of Wafa Mustafa on behalf of her father and the almost 150,000 individuals who are still detained or have forcibly disappeared. And she asked a question in her testimony. She asked, is there a point to address us? And I think we all have to respond positively. There is a point in addressing us, in addressing the UN General Assembly, we have to act. We have to see to it that the fate of the Syrian people is improved, that we get a political solution, that we get humanitarian aid in, and that we get accountability. My question to the briefers would be then again, if they share this view that accountability is key for reconciliation in the country, and if they also back my call to those countries who block accountability, that they go ahead and finally give their green light. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Germany. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
Shukran.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for holding this high-level panel. We thank the briefers for their interventions and for their bravery, especially Sabah Halak, Wafa Mustafa, and Mazen Darwish. Mr. President, the crisis in Syria is a bleak page in the history of Syria. The Syrian people has been subjected to the worst suffering. Children in particular are paying the price. A generation of children have been subjected to unimaginable suffering. 10 years on, we must remember how the crisis began. It began with peaceful protests. In full view of the world, they demanded justice, they demanded freedom. This was met with unparalleled brutality. Since then, the Syrians have been paying a high price for demanding these basic rights. They deserve their aspirations to be met, to live in dignity, to live in freedom. Since the beginning of the crisis, the state of Qatar has warned that violence against civilians will have catastrophic repercussions in Syria and the region. War crimes against humanity, violations of international humanitarian law were perpetrated against Syrian civilians. The state of Qatar has held this position firmly, and at the same time, we have provided humanitarian assistance that displaced people and refugees need. Our assistance was over $2 billion. Mr. President, one of the crimes that have been perpetrated repeatedly is the use of chemical weapons. Impunity constitutes a dangerous precedent. These violations are violations of human rights law and international humanitarian law. All these violations are documented. This is why we need to work collectively to ensure justice and accountability. In this context, the state of Qatar is at the forefront of countries that support the independent, impartial, and international mechanism. The head of the mechanism and her team are playing an important role to ensure that the mechanism fulfills its mandate. Mr. President, the crisis in Syria had serious repercussions not only on Syria but also on international and regional peace and security. It has become apparent to all that military solutions will only lead to more suffering, will destabilize the region. This is why the state of Qatar supports the efforts of the special envoy to Syria to reach a solution through a political process leading to a political transition according to the Geneva Communique, the first Geneva Communique, and Security Council Resolution 2254. This is the only way to end the crisis, to ensure a political transition, and to maintain the unity, territorial integrity, and independence of Syria. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Qatar. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to start by thanking the Commission of Inquiry and the civil society briefers for their compelling testimony on the current situation in Syria, which underlines that the human rights violations and abuses that have characterized the conflict in Syria for 10 years continue. These are human rights abuses that are real, harrowing, scarring violations of fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters. The report on arbitrary detention released by the Commission of Inquiry this week is of particular concern. The industrial-scale system of arbitrary arrests, torture prisons, and enforced disappearances are a clear attempt to silence the Syrian people. Moreover, their inhuman experience in detention centres is designed to instill fear. Women and girls have faced rape, sometimes gang rape, and male detainees have endured rape with objects and also genital mutilation. Meaningful progress on the issue of detainees and missing persons is a central element of Security Council Resolution 2254. As a starting point, the Syrian authorities should provide comprehensive lists of the names of all detainees, clarifying the whereabouts of the 128,000 people who have never emerged from arbitrary detention, including by providing their families with notifications of burial sites of detainees who have died. The Commission of Inquiry documents 32 separate instances of chemical weapons use by Assad's forces. Each use of chemical weapons constitutes a war crime and is the reason why the outstanding issues in Syria's initial chemical weapons declaration are not academic in nature. We will continue to use monthly Security Council discussions to press for progress between the Syrian authorities and the OPCW's declaration and assessment team. I also want to reiterate the UK's commitment to respond robustly to any further use of chemical weapons by Assad's forces. It is important that we do not stand silent in the face of the atrocities documented by the Commission of Inquiry. Since 2012, the UK has contributed over $18 million to support Syrian and international efforts to gather evidence and assist victims of human rights violations and abuses, including support to the UN International Impartial and Independent Mechanism. We have supported Syrian doctors to produce over 360 forensic medical reports, which can act as court-standard evidence of sexual violence and torture. And we've trained 118 doctors to conduct evaluations in accordance with Istanbul Protocol standards. Our support to the Commission for International Justice and Accountability to gather evidence and prepare legal cases for use in national and international courts has contributed to the first conviction of a former member of Daesh, and just last month led to the first ever conviction of a former Syrian regime official, Aid al-Gharib, in Germany for crimes against humanity. This should send a clear message to the Assad regime that they cannot act with impunity. We will continue to support this work to shine a light on human rights violations and abuses in Syria and support delivery of humanitarian aid to Syria. I would like to conclude by reiterating that as we mark the 10-year anniversary of the conflict in Syria, the only sustainable solution is a UN-facilitated political process in line with Resolution 2254, which protects the rights of all Syrians and in which civil society, women, and minorities play a role. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. I'll now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan. But before doing that, let me explain the flow of this session. After giving 10 more members, distinguished delegates, the floor, then I will go back to the panel again and ask the Assistant Secretary General to repeat once again the questions asked here and also the questions asked by the civil society. And then after this part finishes, I go back again to the member countries I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank AST, Ms. Keris, and all the panelists for their remarks. 10 years have passed since the start of the Syrian crisis. Japan is deeply concerned about the deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation on the ground. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbates the suffering of the most vulnerable, such as women, children, people with disabilities, refugees, and internally displaced persons. As reminded by the annual General Assembly resolution on the human rights situation in Syria, human rights and fundamental freedoms of all people in Syria must be fully protected without delay. Japan urged all parties to armed conflict to stop the violence, respect international human rights law and humanitarian law in all areas in Syria, and ensure safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access to the population in need. Accountability is critical for sustainable peace in Syria. Japan will not tolerate impunity for those responsible for gross human rights violations throughout the conflict. The use of chemical weapons is also impermissible under any circumstances. Perpetrators of such acts must be identified and held accountable. Mr. President, Japan has concern over long-standing stalemate as well as the loss of momentum for the settlement of the crisis. The Syrian crisis will never end without a political solution in line with the Security Council Resolution 2254. Continued dialogue among the Syrian people is essential for advancing the political process. We urge all relevant parties, including the Syrian government, to play a constructive role in the Constitutional Committee to make substantial progress. Mr. President, in addressing this crisis, Japan continues to play its part under the renewed commitment of the international community toward a sustainable solution of the Syrian crisis. I thank you.
Thank the distinguished representative of Japan. Now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Australia also joins in thanking the panel for its briefing on the ongoing human rights abuses in Syria. This month marks 10 years since the start of the conflict in Syria, a decade of immense suffering for the Syrian people. This grim anniversary is an opportunity to reflect on what more the global community can do to ensure a peaceful resolution to the conflict and an end to the killing, maiming, abuse and displacement of Syrian civilians. The recent report by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria laid bare the Syrian regime's egregious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, including acts which the Commission claim likely constitute crimes against humanity and war crimes. We call on the Syrian regime to cooperate fully with the Human Rights Council and the Commission of Inquiry, particularly by granting the Commission and its staff immediate and unfettered access to Syrian territory. Australia condemns the continued use of arbitrary detention and disappearances, and we express concern at reports of financial extortion of families by Syrian officials in exchange for information about detained relatives. We welcome the Commission of Inquiry's upcoming report, which provides greater detail of these abuses. Mr. President, we are also deeply disturbed by the deliberate targeting of medical facilities, hospitals and medical workers by Syrian forces, severely limiting the Syrian health system's ability to provide life-saving assistance to an already vulnerable population. This undermines global humanitarian efforts and dangerously hinders the response to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Australia regrets the lack of progress made at the recent meetings of the Constitutional Committee, recognising that the only viable end to the conflict in Syria is through a peaceful political solution. We further call on the Syrian regime to engage in good faith with the UN-facilitated process. I thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Australia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, President. I want to thank you and the OHCHR for putting together a very important panel and for giving a prominent voice to Syrian civil society representatives. We want to salute them for their courage and their very important work. The numerous reports by the Commission of Inquiry and other bodies, as well as the statements today, speak a very clear language to us. The 10 years of the armed conflict in the Syrian Arab Republic have been characterized by systematic abuses of human rights that amount to crimes against humanity. There is an entire generation in Syria that knows no other reality than the one that has been documented in the last 10 years. ASG Kerries has spoken of a difficult anniversary. It is a difficult anniversary, I think, emotionally, certainly for the countless victims in Syria. But I think it's also an uncomfortable anniversary for this organization, and in particular its political bodies, in light of the fact that meaningful action in the Security Council has been blocked time and again, including by numerous uses of the veto. The work of the Commission of Inquiry, OPCW, numerous civil society organizations has produced vast and ample evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the conflict. This assembly has played an important role by setting up the IIIM in December 2016, while the Security Council in 2014 was unable to refer the situation to the ICC as had been demanded by a very significant number of member states due to the use of the veto by 2 permanent members. We want to echo the view expressed repeatedly in this discussion that there can be no sustainable peace for Syria without accountability and justice. Last week's verdict by a German court, which found a former Syrian regime official guilty of being an accomplice to crimes against humanity, is a milestone, but it is also only a beginning. We will certainly continue supporting the work of the IIIM in particular and encourage more universal jurisdiction cases. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in the country continues to be devastating. The conflict is the largest refugee and displacement crisis of our time, and the current food security reaches record levels. The Security Council last year, after arduous negotiations, decided to reduce cross-border crossings, which has further exacerbated the crisis, and we call on the Council to take the necessary steps later this year to remedy this situation. We also do see a role for this Assembly in that discussion, given that it has taken up the question of humanitarian situation in Syria before. Finally, we remain very concerned about the issue of sexual and gender-based violence that has been used systematically as a means to attack and terrorize the civilian population, as we have also heard in a very powerful manner today. This disproportionately affects women and girls, but in fact these violations have also been documented as being perpetrated by men and boys, in particular in detention settings. We echo the calls made both from the panel and in this hall by our colleagues that the issue of detention be addressed effectively and immediately. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway.
Thank you, President, and thank you and ASG Kerries for organizing this very important meeting. Let me also thank the brave panelists for their strong and heartbreaking testimonies. This month marks 10 years since the start of the tragedy that is the Syrian crisis. The atrocities committed and the human suffering have been appalling. It is a sad reflection, as we have heard, that still today, violations and abuses of human rights in Syria continue with little end in sight. Against this somber backdrop, we welcome the convening of this panel of experts from the Commission of Inquiry and Syrian civil society. Not only is there a need for the atrocities committed in Syria to be documented, there must be accountability for the perpetrators. The Commission of Inquiry has Norway's full support. Moreover, human rights defenders and civil society voices need to be heard, both when documenting what is happening in Syria, as well as in finding a lasting and inclusive solution to the conflict. Norway continues to support the effort of the UN and the Constitutional Committee, including the work of the Civil Society Support Room and the Women's Advisory Board. Yet, a nationwide and permanent ceasefire is urgently needed to prevent further human suffering in Syria. For our part, Norway will use its seats in the Security Council to work for progress on the political track, increased protection of civilians, and improved humanitarian access. Let me highlight in particular the many missing persons and the use of arbitrary detention in Syria. Not only may they constitute a violation of international humanitarian and human rights law, they remain a severe obstacle to progress on the political track. Norway strongly supports the emphasis the UN system places on the issue of missing persons in Syria. We are also outraged to hear of the prevalence of rape and other forms of sexual violence and used against both boys and girls. We owe it to the people of Syria not to forget these atrocities. At the same time, we also need to do our utmost to try to bring the conflict to an end. Accountability is central to achieving sustainable peace and facilitating a national reconciliation process. In this respect, could I ask the member of the panel how they view the best way to combine the aspects of accountability and reconciliation as part of a political solution to the conflict? Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Norway. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Poland welcomes this timely and very important high-level panel on the General Assembly on the situation of human rights in Syria. We align ourselves with the statement delivered by the European Union. Allow me, Mr. President, to make some additional remarks in my national capacity. 10 years since the beginning of the conflict in Syria, violence and protracted instability continue to negatively affect lives of its people. The human rights abuses and lack of accountability for the violations pose a severe threat to a long-standing solution of the conflict through reconciliation of all segments of Syrian society in years to come. We remain particularly concerned about the effect of violence on the most vulnerable members of Syrian population, in particular children and members of ethnic and religious minorities and persons with disabilities. The 10th year of the armed conflict means that millions of Syrian children have known nothing else but life in fear. They suffer from malnourishment and are deprived of their fundamental rights, including the right to food, water and sanitation, right to education and right to health. The lack of access to education and the experienced trauma lead to creating lost generations in Syria, which will affect the future of the country and any prospects for a recovery and rebuilding of a free and democratic Syria. We want to underline our concern regarding the continued acts of violence and terror directed against persons belonging to religious and ethnic minorities in Syria, the grave human rights violations and abuses committed by states and non-state actors are extensive and affect people in a complex manner. They undermine the social cohesion and fuel sectarian tensions. The consequences of such phenomena due to the Middle East cultural diversity are hard to predict but can be very dramatic. It is estimated that 1.5 million people in Syria are now living with permanent impairments because of the conflict, including 86,000 people who have lost limbs. Persons with disabilities face exclusion and discrimination, including during the distribution of humanitarian aid and access to basic services. We remain concerned about the lack of progress on the political track. Nevertheless, and still, we believe that any sustainable solution to the conflict in Syria can be achieved only in line with the provision of the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 and the 2012 Geneva Communique. In this vein, we fully support the efforts by the Special Envoy Geir Petersen and call for all the parties to engage meaningfully in the negotiations. Poland joins other like-minded partners in calling for a safe, full and sustained access for humanitarian aid as well as protection of the humanitarian workers. With regards to the situation of millions of Syrian refugees displaced by the conflict, Poland reiterates its position that large-scale returns could only take place when conditions on the ground allow for safe, voluntary and dignified returns in line with the criteria set by the UNHCR. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the distinguished representative of Poland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome this opportunity to further discuss the situation of human rights in Syria, and we are grateful to ASG Keris for introducing and moderating this panel, and to the panelists for their contributions. We listened attentively to what they said, and we found their testimony very heartbreaking and extremely important. We subscribe to the statement of the European Union and would like to add a few remarks of our own. As confirmed by today's briefers, the tragedy that has been unfolding in Syria for almost a decade has taken an exceptionally heavy toll on the Syrian people in terms of loss of lives, systematic violations of human rights, vast destruction of its livelihood and infrastructures, and massive displacement of millions of civilians. This enormous suffering is now further aggravated by the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis. In order to achieve a sustainable peace, it is of paramount importance to make sure that there is no impunity for human rights violations and abuses committed in the country. All the perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity and those who are profiting from the war must be held accountable and duly prosecuted. Italy will continue to support all international actions to fight impunity and to gather evidence with a view to future legal action, including by the International, Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria and the Commission of Inquiry. It is a matter of principle and justice, an inherent part of any reconciliation process in a Syrian society that has been torn apart by years of conflict. In this regard, I wish to reiterate Italy's long-standing support for United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254, which outlines the main features of any credible political solution. Without a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, UN-facilitated political process, we cannot hope to bring about a durable peace, curb regional instability, and prevent the resurgence of the terrorist threat. We commend the efforts by the UN Special Envoy Pedersen to give new momentum to the Constitutional Committee to advance on important files, such as the release of detainees and missing persons, and to foster dialogue between key players, both inside and outside the country, to pave the way for mutual understanding and reconciliation. At the same time, humanitarian support in the entire Syrian territory and in the neighboring countries hosting large Syrian communities remains for us a priority. Every year, Italy commits approximately 45 million euros to initiatives in response to the Syrian crisis, both in Syria and in neighboring countries hosting large communities of Syrian refugees. This effort will continue also in 2021, and in this respect, we welcome the announcement that the 5th Brussels conference will take place on March 30th. In addition to the further mobilization of funds, it will be particularly important to ensure unhindered humanitarian access to all parts of the country by renewing and broadening the cross-border resolution in the United Nations Security Council in July. As pointed out in the intervention of the EU representative, we also continue to uphold the position that assistance in the economic reconstruction of Syria will be possible only when a credible political process is underway. Within such parameters, Italy will continue to do its utmost to provide aid and support to the Syrian population. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Italy. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I join the colleagues in expressing my appreciation to you for convening this meeting, and also appreciation to the panelists for their briefs. My country allied itself with the statement made by the delegation of the European Union earlier today, and in my national capacity, I would like to make the following remark. We are extremely concerned that on the cusp of the 11th year of the conflict, Syria has no peace. People continue to suffer, and perpetrators of most heinous violations and abuses of international human rights law and international humanitarian law are not brought to justice. Compounded with the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, the conflict leaves the Syrian population at a particularly perilous juncture. We condemn the indiscriminate use of force by the Syrian regime against civilians, which has caused immense human suffering and incited the spread of violent extremism and violent extremist groups. After 10 years of suffering, half of the pre-war, more than half of the pre-war population had been displaced, more than 500,000 civilian casualties, and more than 100,000 just disappeared. Ensuring justice has to be a priority. And we appreciate the efforts of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry and findings of the Commission that many of the more than 6.2 million displaced persons in the country, and I quote, were victims of the crime against humanity of forcible transfer, the war of crime of ordering the displacement of the civilian population, or both. These are deplorable. We also reiterate Georgia's support to the international impartial and independent mechanism, the IIIM. Now, the IIIM, together with the Commission of Inquiry, should facilitate and expedite a fair and independent criminal proceedings in accordance with the international law principles and its mandate. Despite the calls of the international community, the Syrian regime continues to ignore the obligation to protect the civilian population. We thus once again call on the regime to cease attacks against civilians and civilian objects, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, to allow safe, full, unhindered, and sustained humanitarian assistance to alleviate the suffering of the civilian population, especially in the northwest of Syria, and cooperate fully with the Commission of Inquiry, including by granting it immediate, safe, and unhindered access throughout the entire territory. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Georgia. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Thank you, Mr. President, Assistant Secretary General. Sitting here listening to the testimonies, we should all feel the heavy weight of responsibility for the continued suffering of the Syrian people. To Wafa Ali Mustafa, I say you are right to wonder what the point is. Any objective assessment would come to the conclusion that the international community has failed to protect Syrians, including your father, from the Assad regime, its enablers, armed groups, and terrorist organizations. We have indeed failed. But I'm glad you came. It was the right decision. I'm glad you all came, and I thank you for your testimonies. The 73,000 Syrian refugees resettled in Canada will no doubt enrich the social fabric of our country, but the cause of their exodus remains a horrible blight on the world and a festering wound for many Syrians. The Commission of Inquiry's latest report illustrates in gruesome detail how Syrians have suffered crimes against humanity, war crimes, and human rights abuses over the past decade. I thank the COI commissioners and their teams for their presentations today and for their painstaking work. We cannot forget the victims of this conflict or abandon efforts to hold those responsible to account. As the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights said, Syrian voices should be at the center of our efforts moving forward. That's why we were so pleased to hear from our civil society panelists earlier today. To complement their testimony, we ourselves had asked other Syrian civil society partners who couldn't be here what messages they would share with the General Assembly if they were able to be in our seat today. Unsurprisingly, they raised many of the same issues, but I would like to use my time to talk about what we heard directly from them on the rights of detainees, on the rights of the displaced, and the need for transitional justice. First, like we heard today, they demanded the immediate release of all those arbitrarily detained by the Assad regime and other armed groups. Neutral international actors must be given access to all political detention facilities. They and we expect the Assad regime to disclose the whereabouts or fate of all those forcibly disappeared and support independent mechanisms that seek to do the same. Generic death certificates and mass graves are wholly inadequate. Moreover, they are abhorrent for so many families that have been left paralyzed by the disappearance of a loved one. They are also abhorrent for us. I will now switch to French. Deuxièmement,
secondly, they mentioned the fact that the capacity of Syrians to go home doesn't just depend on their own personal security, but also on the capacity to take ownership of their material goods, including their own properties. Our efforts to repair violations of human rights must include rights to civil documentation and recognition under the law, in particular when it comes to the rights to property. The violations of these rights affecting all Syrians has had a disproportionate impact on the freedom of movement, as well as the women's rights to inheritance. Finally, I will repeat what our partners have already said and what we all know. To reach lasting peace, Syrians need justice. All parties to the conflict who have committed violations of human rights must be held accountable. This includes responsibility for sexual violence and gender-based violence.
We owe it to all Syrians not just to hear, but to listen and to act. We must move forward with a renewed determination to alleviate their suffering and find a lasting political solution to this conflict in line with Resolution 2254. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd also like to thank the briefers this morning, the members of the Commission on Inquiry and the civil society representatives. We applaud the courage and the hard work of the members of the Syrian civil society organizations. Today's briefing is an important opportunity for the General Assembly to discuss human rights and the international humanitarian law violations and the humanitarian crisis in Syria, complementing the work of the Security Council. Austria aligns itself with the EU statement delivered earlier, but let me add 2 points from our Austrian perspective. First, as many have said, these past years we have seen terrible crimes committed in Syria. Austria wishes to remind the Syrian government and its allies of their obligations under international human rights law and humanitarian law. The past decade witnessed a near complete denial of a core IHL principle, namely the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. We saw the illegal use of chemical weapons. We saw targeted attacks on schools and hospitals. We heard about the terrible suffering of the civilian population, in particular women and girls and people with disabilities. We heard about the terrible situation of detainees. Millions of Syrians have fled the country or become IDPs. As many have said this morning, the humanitarian situation in Syria is dire. And if we want to help here, we need safe, full, unhindered, and sustained access for humanitarian actors to the population in all of Syria. We urge Security Council members to agree to a renewal of the authorization of cross-border humanitarian assistance in July. Second, there is a lack of accountability for the crimes committed by all parties to the conflict and unwillingness to end impunity for perpetrators. Let me underline our position that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, was created precisely for this type of situation. We reiterate our call, urging the Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Additionally, we believe that a special criminal tribunal in the region should be established to ensure accountability for the most serious crimes. This should go hand in hand with capacity building for national justice to ensure due process on the national and local level. For international and national justice to succeed, we need to know what happened. We need evidence. Austria fully supports the very important work of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria, as well as the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism to collect evidence and document atrocity crimes committed on Syrian soil. This evidence will also assist in initiatives and cases pursued around the world, including by the Netherlands and also in Germany, as we heard, addressing the question of accountability for acts of torture and other war crimes, as well as crimes against humanity. Last year, in 2020, Austria amended its own national laws on legal assistance to enable full cooperation with the IIIM, and we encourage other states to do the same. Austria also provided substantial financial support to both the Commission of Inquiry and the IIIM. In the context of evidence and establishing the facts on the ground, we also call on Syria to fully cooperate with the fact-finding mission of the OPCW, and we urge the Security Council to follow up on the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2218. Mr. President, in order to ensure adherence to international law, enable humanitarian assistance, and permit the full application of justice, we need the cessation of violence in Syria. We call for an effective nationwide ceasefire in Syria, for an inclusive political process built on justice for all victims and national reconciliation, and for full support for the brave efforts of civil society, such as from the organizations that we have heard from today. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria. Now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland, and then to France, and then to the panel.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. Ireland aligns with the statement of the European Union and thanks the members of the panel for their contributions this morning, harrowing as they were. We strongly support the vital work of the OHCHR, and we're very pleased to see the Assistant Secretary General Brands Keris with us this morning presiding over our work. The powerful testimonies we heard from the panel members, Mr. President, show us what an enormous human tragedy the Syria conflict has delivered. The violations of international humanitarian law and widespread systematic violent violations and abuses of human rights continue to shock us all. The suffering of Syrian children in particular is almost unbearable to contemplate, with continued evidence of grave violations and abuses committed against children in contravention of international law. As we heard also very directly and in a moving way today, conflict-related sexual violence and sexual and gender-based violence have been extensively documented, with sexual violence particularly prevalent in government detention centres and widely used as a tactic of war, torture and terrorism. This is simply unacceptable. I commend the members of the panel for their recommendations to facilitate improvements in civilian protection and accountability measures. Throughout the conflict, Ireland has consistently called for an immediate end to these human rights violations and abuses. We strongly support accountability for the crimes that have been committed. Put simply, tackling impunity starts with documenting crimes. Ireland is committed to supporting the work of the international, impartial, and independent mechanism whose experts have highlighted in clear, and I would say horrifying detail, the scale of human rights violations in Syria. We also support the work of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic, which has set out detailed evidence of multiple violations of international human rights law. Their reports testify to brutal acts, including the bombing of schools and hospitals. As we know, civil society and human rights defenders have also been targeted. Ireland will continue to champion respect for human rights, for humanitarian access and accountability, including through our role today on the Security Council. Ireland and its EU partners will continue to support the referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Ireland is firmly committed to meeting the enormous humanitarian needs we know exist in Syria. Since the conflict began, Ireland has provided almost 170 million euros in funding, our largest ever response to a single crisis. As well as funding, however, we believe it is vital that humanitarian workers are granted rapid, safe, and unimpeded access to all people in need. And we are working with Norway as co-pen holders on the Security Council to preserve humanitarian access in Syria. There can be no durable peace without justice and accountability, and Ireland strongly supports the efforts of the UN Special Envoy in that regard. A permanent ceasefire must be agreed and adhered to by all of the armed groups and foreign actors, as well as by the Syrian regime. Before concluding, I have a couple of questions for the members of the panel. We want to know what more we, the members of the international community who share responsibility, what more can we do to tackle impunity for human rights violations perpetrated in this conflict? I want to ask that particularly in respect of conflict-related sexual violence and the grave violations we know are happening against children. And a second question to the panel, amongst the restorative justice mechanisms enumerated in the Commission of Inquiry's 15th report, which does the panel think should be prioritised? Thank you, Mr. President.
The distinguished representative of Ireland. Now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France and then to the panel.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Good afternoon, President. I would like to thank Ms. Brans-Keris and all of those who have spoken from civil society for their extremely interesting statements and also for their bravery. And I would like to thank all the briefers for their statements about the situation in Syria, which also relate to the humanitarian situation in the country. President, France aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and would like to make some comments in its national capacity. After some 10 years of conflict, the situation remains alarming. Human rights continue to be systematically violated, in particular by the Syrian regime, which bears the main responsibility for this tragedy. We can only note the persistence of acts of torture, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence, and serious violations of children's rights. It is crucial that all parties respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights, as we have always said. Aggravated by COVID-19, the humanitarian situation is getting worse. The rise in medical needs of 20% in comparison to last year means that unhindered humanitarian access is more crucial than ever. More than half of the population suffer from food insecurity. The systematic blocking of humanitarian aid by the regime highlights the need to protect the cross-border crossings. In spite of international humanitarian law, the people and medical workers and civilian infrastructures remain targeted by indiscriminate attacks. The protection of civilians must remain a priority. 14 humanitarian workers have lost their lives since the beginning of last year. We strongly condemn these attacks, and these crimes will not remain unpunished. Combating impunity in this context remains a priority for us. France supports the Commission of Inquiry for its crucial work, which complements that carried out by the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism. The latest reports of the COI details abuse and violations in the country, including by the Syrian regime, but also under areas controlled by Turkey. This has shown war crimes, including in the detention centers controlled by the regime. A historic trial is nevertheless being held at the moment, and several other criminal trials are also underway in France currently. We must put an end to the impunity for crimes committed by the regime. To establish the facts, that is a crucial part of the process, and indeed we welcome the work of the NGOs present here working towards that end. The crisis in Syria is far from having been ended. We must ensure that all work is done to ensure that a humanitarian pause is allowed for in line with Security Resolution 2254 and in line with the appeal launched by the Secretary General. The continued hostilities in the northwest and the northeast are extremely worrying, as well as the increased instability in other areas, including the south. We reiterate our support to the Special Envoy of the Secretary General in setting up a credible strategy. It is crucial that the provisions of Resolution 2254 be fully implemented, including the convening of free elections. France calls for the full participation of Syrian women within the process, in line with the Women, Peace and Security process. Until the regime commits to a credible transition in line with the aforementioned resolution, France and the European Union will not finance reconstruction and will not normalize relations with the regime. Finally, all attempts to ensure that Western countries bear responsibility for the situation are doomed to failure. Sanctions are extremely targeted in their nature, and those who have committed crimes must be held accountable for their crimes. Before concluding, I wish to ask the following question to the panelists, in particular when it comes to the issue of detention. I wish to know to what extent the cooperation with the Red Cross will allow for the situation to be improved. Thank you.
I think the first round of comments and questions has been finished. I now give the floor to the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights to start the second part of the high-level panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. President and distinguished delegates. I will call on the panel in the following order. Hani Megali on behalf of the Commission of Inquiry, then Ms. Wafa Mustafa, then Mr. Mazen Darwish, and then Ms. Sabah Al-Halak. But before that, I will remind them of the questions that were received just now from the distinguished delegates, and I will add some questions that we also have received from civil society organizations. So we did have the question from the United States concerning detention, torture, and how the international community can better support former detainees and victims. From Germany, do you agree that accountability is key, and do you support the call to those who blocked referrals to ICC from the Security Council to deblock them? Norway, how can we best combine accountability and reconciliation as part of a political solution to the conflict? For Ireland, 2 questions. What can the international community do to prevent impunity for human rights violations, especially focusing on conflict-related sexual violence and violence against children, how to do that better? And also restorative justice, which of those measures that the Commission of Inquiry in the 15th report listed, which should be prioritized? And just now we also heard the question from France on the cooperation with the Red Cross, as well, that you just heard concerning the tensions, if it allows the situation to be improved. I wanted to add a few questions. I have too many to be able to add all of them, but also a big focus on detention, enforced disappearance, and accountability from the side of civil society. Detention by all parties to the conflict affecting victims throughout Syria. So essential to have a comprehensive solution for detainees and forcefully disappeared for any political progress. And some civil society organizations stress the importance to focus at present on short-term justice for the families of the disappeared, especially those who are refugees in neighboring countries, and also support for family associations and NGOs that work directly with the grassroots on this. In that regard, the questions are: what more should be done to achieve justice for all detainees, missing persons, including those in government-held areas? What are the current and future consequences of the failure to achieve accountability for international crimes committed during the past decade in terms of people's trauma, chances for a just and peaceful future for the country, and in terms of the Syrian government's actions? The government of Syria has denied that it's detaining unlawfully its citizens while providing death notices to families of civilians without details relating to the circumstances of their death, nor returning their bodies. What are the different avenues to push the government of Syria to reveal the names of those in custody and those who passed away? And also, in terms of domestic Syrian law guarantees, what needs to be done to ensure that Syrian law is enforced, including respecting a maximum pre-trial period of 60 days, preventing civilians to be tried by military courts, and ensuring the right to be assisted by a lawyer. Would the speakers support the establishment of an independent, impartial mechanism to investigate information about detainees and the disappeared, with a view to disclosing the fate and whereabouts of all those who have been forcefully disappeared or arbitrarily detained, and ensuring accountability and redress for victims and their families? We have, unfortunately, a lot more questions, but I will add a couple of them. One on civil society as well. What is the impact of the Commission of Inquiry documentation and reports on the policy of the UN and key states in relation to the government of Syria, and how can Syrian civil society organizations help make this impact more meaningful? On displacement and return, what are the main obstacles for safe, voluntary, and dignified return? And what are your recommendations for civil society, for international organizations, and states to improve conditions for safe, voluntary, and dignified concern? Two more issues, one on the chemical weapons that were mentioned by several of those who took the floor. So the questions from NGOs: did the government of Syria conduct any investigation on the use of chemical weapons during the conflict? Was there any attempt by the government of Syria or other parties to collect samples on the ground or on bodies of victims after the alleged use of chemical weapons. And finally, a last question on digital surveillance. Has the Commission of Inquiry investigated the government of Syria's digital surveillance practices and their facilitation of human rights violations potentially? There were also other questions, but unfortunately we can't get to them. And now I will ask the panel to do the impossible on top of it, which is very concise answers. So pick your questions to add information to that was not already given, please. And please try to be as short as possible. So the floor goes first to Hani Megali, please, on behalf of the Commission of Inquiry, please.
Thank you, distinguished President of the UN General Assembly, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, fellow panelists, Sabah Halak, Wafa Ali Mustafa, Mazen Darwish, Excellencies, friends, a big thank you especially to OHCHR for organizing this high-level panel to examine the human rights situation in Syria. It's been a rich but really quite sobering discussion thus far, and I'm aware that there are better speakers to come after me who know the situation much better. So I'm also worried about taking up too much time. And what I will do is to try maybe and cluster the questions into 2 or 3 key areas. One of them was around the sort of justice and accountability issue. Is accountability the key? The question around how the international community can help on detentions, the questions that came up around the pursuance of justice and accountability in the International Criminal Court, etc. And I think what I would like to say is, and this has been the approach of the Commission of Inquiry, we have been talking more and more in the last few years about justice and accountability, because we see the two as going together hand in hand, and they're not contradictory, and it's actually what we're hearing from the Syrians, and you will hear it from my fellow panelists. And that means pursuing criminal accountability, and the Commission has called for a referral to the International Criminal Court of the situation in Syria, and has also supported the efforts that are going on in national jurisdictions. I think we've supported at least now 60 discrete investigations going on, and maybe 300 inquiries that have come to us. And we support that without question, and that has to continue. At the same time, we feel that has to go alongside listening to the Syrians and understanding what their justice-based needs are. And these are priorities that can be dealt with now. Criminal justice may take its time, and so the two go together. And in talking about that, I'll focus maybe on 2 or 3 issues, and here's where I'll focus on the question of detention and disappeared, because I think that's one of the keys that you're hearing from all Syrians. You know, what can be done to improve the situation around detentions and disappearances in Syria? And here again, you know, the first thing that families will tell you is that, you know, they want to exercise the right to know. They want to know where the missing are and where the detainees are, who's alive, who's dead. And in order to do that, and it's not just the Syrian state, but it's primarily the Syrian state, the state should provide information about who it's detaining, as should the other parties. And it should allow access to the places of detention for the families and for international humanitarian organizations like the ICRC. And in fact, when you look at the obligations that Syria itself agreed it would comply with during its last Universal Periodic Review discussion in 2016, this is exactly what it said it would do. It would provide families with information about those in detention, and it would provide access. This was in 2016. These were the questions posed to Syria at the time, and Syria promised to do this. And as I say, it's not just Syria, but it's all the other parties in this conflict who are holding detainees. Alongside that are the releases. And, you know, all of us have been calling for releases of those arbitrarily detained, and it's even now more of a concern because of the onset of the pandemic. These are the types of justice issues that go alongside the call for criminal justice and accountability and impunity, and an end to impunity. Another area that links with that, of course, is the question of the displaced in Syria and the refugees, and the ability of people to be able to return to their homes. And of course, whereas most people, and you've heard already, most people want to go home, they're not going to go home right now because the situation is not right for them to go back home now. And that links to security, which links to both the conflict, but it also links to the fear of arrests, arbitrary arrest and detention, conscription and being sent to the front lines. It links to issues around lack of having proper documentation, civil documentation, identity cards, marriage certificates, family booklets, etc., without which people are suffering to conduct their day-to-day lives. But also they're afraid that if they don't have those right documents, they will be picked up if they try to return to their homes within the areas that the state is in control of. And so that in itself is another area that warrants immediate attention. I should have mentioned earlier around the question of the disappeared and the missing, there's been a consistent call for the establishment of a mechanism that will help the families of the disappeared begin to work more effectively on the issue of the missing and the disappeared in Syria. And this is a call, again, that the international community should take up seriously and look at how that can be established. I will just say that, you know, you've heard eloquently from my fellow panelists, you know, all of them require tremendous support from the international community for the work they're doing, and I will say that again is a priority that should be addressed by all of you. And I think the last question, which was addressed directly, I think, to the Commissioner around the question of digital surveillance practices, I have to say we don't have access to Syria, and we've not been able to look at that issue thoroughly. But I'm glad it's been brought to our attention, and we will, I think, give it due attention. I'll stop there because I'm mindful of the need and the time for the others to speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Megali. So now I give the floor to Ms. Wafa Mustafa, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I wish the time allows to answer all these questions. I have a few points to highlight. First, regarding the question about what can the international community do for survivors and maybe for families of detainees. I mean, I'm as a survivor from detention in Assad's prisons in 2011. I would say that the first thing that I need to actually survive is the immediate release of all the detainees, all those who are still in prisons, not only in Assad's detention centers, but in those prisons of all other actors in the country, including my own dad and including the women that I've met, unfortunately, during my detention period. And I have to say that if we are to survive and actually to be able to continue, we need to do something about that. This is not about the past. This trauma is not in the past. This is still ongoing. And this takes me to another point regarding accountability. I think that it's very important that steps towards accountability are made using international mechanisms such as the universal jurisdiction. But there are three things that I have in my mind. First is that the crime of detention and enforced disappearance is still ongoing in Syria. I mean, now while we're talking, some people are being detained and forcibly disappeared in Syria. Secondly, the at least 130,000 people who are documented to be detained by the Syrian regime are still disappeared, among whom is my own dad. And this means that the war criminals actually responsible for all these crimes in the past and today are still being able to commit these crimes without any prosecution. So I think that we should, any justice for Syria must start with the release of all detainees, the end of the ongoing detention, and prosecuting these war criminals, hopefully with Assad himself at the International Criminal Court. And one more thing is actually regarding listening to Syrians. I think that as a survivor of detention and as a family member of a detainee and as an activist who took part in the protests in 2011 demanding justice and dignity and freedom for my country, I need my voice and my story to be heard. I need our stories, all Syrian stories, to be recognized. Being here today is one step. Listening to us as all Syrians is one step. This obviously helps validating our experiences and our stories and memories. And witnesses like mine and the others are actually the basis for the trial that is happening today in Copeland. Those brave survivors and family members who actually took the risk to go to actually a courthouse and tell their stories again and wait for accountability and justice from this court is one thing. As Syrians on daily basis, we are fighting not only on the battle is not only on the ground, but we have now a battle over narratives in Syria. As activists and as people who demanded and still demand freedom for our country on daily basis, we are fighting against the propaganda of the Assad regime supported by Russia to actually defeat and deny our stories and our experiences. And that takes me maybe to one last point regarding the ICRC. I would just like to highlight that today still families of detainees, not only inside Syria, but even in neighboring countries, are scared actually to go and register their loved ones. They are scared because they know that the regime might give a reaction that threatens their safety and might maybe even threatens the safety of their loved ones being held in detention centers. Maybe just one last sentence. I would say that in 2 weeks we will be approaching the anniversary of the Syrian Revolution, and the revolution that started 10 years ago and now unfortunately being described as a civil war, which I believe is not only incorrect but also unjust to the years of activism we've been doing, and to the efforts of millions of Syrians like my dad, who actually was not armed and did not actually threaten anyone. Their only demand was freedom and justice for their country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mustafa. I am so sorry that we are so short of time, but we still have two panelists for some brief interventions, as concise as possible, please. So, Mr. Darwish, please, the floor is yours.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you
very much. In addition to the answers we heard from Wafa and Gali, I would like to say that no sustainable peace can be reached in Syria without justice. We can ask the members to the parties to the conflict, international and regional, to cease fire. But we need justice for that. Without justice, without accountability, we would be pushing the country to a new war, a war to revenge what happened in Syria can not be resolved only with a political solution, with a political process. The warlords are now the ones leading the negotiations to resolve the issue by having the warlords share interests without paying attention to victims and their needs. No peace could be achieved without justice and accountability. It is not acceptable to ask refugees to return to the country. I'm one of the refugees who have been subjected to detention, torture. I was near dead and I managed to flee Syria. I am lucky to remain alive. How could I be asked to return and to have my kids with me and go back to Syria without making sure that there are guarantees that there is accountability, guarantees that those security apparatus and those perpetrators are held accountable? Ensuring the non-recurrence is crucial for return. It is also not acceptable to know that we will be able to defeat terrorism with military means. We tried it in Iraq and in other places, and it did not succeed. The fertile ground for terrorism is the absence of justice, the grievances of people, the feeling of injustice, and lack of development. Therefore, the absence of real justice and accountability would be the oxygen for terrorist groups, not only in Syria, but all over the world. Therefore, justice and accountability. We do not ask for them for revenge, not at all. It is an issue of guaranteeing better future for our kids. Without justice and accountability, we are not giving away and sacrificing the rights of those dead and suffering, but we are risking the future of Syrian kids. Establishing an international entity on detainees and missing people is very important. This does not only include a small group. There is no single family in Syria that does not have someone in detention or missing person. We heard Wafa, and when she spoke about her day-to-day suffering, this should be brought to an end. An entity should be established with authorities, and pressure should be brought to bear on the Syrian regime to give in all names and details about all these people. And a special international fund should be established to support the families of detained and missing persons. The psychological trauma is still felt by all, even those who have been released from the prison. Prison is still in their hearts and minds. We need to ensure a stable life for those people. We need to make sure that their families are living safely. Mass graves are all over the place in Syria. We provided international bodies with the locations of these mass graves. The DNA samples preservation should start right now. We should identify the remains of the dead people and make sure that those remains are buried in a dignified manner. Referral to the ICC, of course, this would help achieving justice, but it is not the whole justice. We want to find a path for transitional justice led by Syrians, but this requires a political transition. But at the minimum level, the crimes with chemical weapons, as established by OPCW, JIM, and other international entities, all prove that chemical weapons have been used against civilians. Those crimes should not be passed without accountability. If we allowed this regime to enjoy impunity, in particular when it comes to the use of chemical weapons without accountability, that means we are killing 70 years of morals and human rights that have been put in place after World War II. Those crimes and those weapons are not an incidental crime. Allowing what happened in Syria without accountability means they could be repeated and reoccurred in other parts of the world, and this is totally unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to our fourth panelist, Ms. Sabah Al-Halak. Please, the floor is yours.
شكرا يعني
Thank you for my colleagues who spoke before me. In brief, no sustainable peace without justice, without accountability. And by accountability, I stress the need of female detainees, especially when it comes to systemic sexual violence. And I stress the importance of supporting those female survivors. They need psychological support, economic support, material support. They are victims of the regime and other groups. Third point, within Syria, it is important to have Transitional Justice Center or Council that takes into consideration all transitional justice issues and the mainstream gender aspect. In Syria, 40 women are heading the households of 800 families. So ensuring their rights is important. So it is important to take this file back from the warlords in Asatan to the UN. It is a humanitarian issue. It is not just a number of figures to be exchanged among the armed groups and the regime. In conclusion, I stress no sustainable peace without participation of women, and no democracy without ensuring our rights, and no sustainable development without our participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, we concluded the interventions from the panel. So, thank you.
I thank the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and our distinguished panelists for their contributions to this discussion. I now open the second round of discussions with the distinguished delegates. I have 14 speakers on my list, and the Secretariat has announced that we can go until 1:30. So in order to hear as many speakers as possible within the limited time, may I request delegations to make their interventions concise and not longer than 3 minutes for statements by individual member states. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Switzerland also thanks the panelists for their briefings and this dialogue that at times has been astounding. We welcome the opportunity for the General Assembly to hear this high-level panel on the human rights situation in Syria. This meeting unfortunately coincides with the 10th anniversary of the beginning of the Syrian conflict. People are still suffering, and Switzerland would like to take this opportunity to share the following points. First, Switzerland remains gravely concerned by the humanitarian situation in Syria and by the systematic and repeated human rights violations, as well as the violations of international humanitarian law committed by all of the parties to the conflict in Syria. In this context, we should continue to prioritize protection of civilians. We call on all of the parties to the conflict to respect their obligations under international law. We also recall the need to ensure quick, lasting and unimpeded humanitarian access for all people who need it. It's essential that the alleged perpetrators of crimes be brought to account and justice be provided for victims and their families, that they receive reparation and that their right to the truth is recognized. This is why Switzerland supports the work of the International Mechanism for the International Impartial and Independent Inquiry. These instruments play a key role in contributing to accountability in this area. Given the scale and the seriousness of these violations, Switzerland's request that the Security Council, and indeed it has been doing this since the beginning of the conflict, refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Secondly, Switzerland recognizes the crucial role played by Syrian civil society, in particular in documenting violations of human rights and also in providing evidence of the priorities for victims. A number of stakeholders, including some of the panelists we've heard of, undergone considerable risks in order to reach the attention of the international community and draw it to these serious violations. Their efforts should be hailed, supported and protected. We recall that these actors should be able to work freely without any reprisals. Thirdly, Switzerland welcomes the joint efforts that have led to the initial criminal trials for crimes committed in Syria within different national jurisdictions. It is crucial that we fight against impunity, therefore this is an encouraging development. These trials show that justice for Syria is not an illusion, but is a process which is progressing step by step. Switzerland remains committed to defending these efforts and supports all of the actors that are contributing to them. Mr. President, only an inclusive political solution pursuant to Security Council Resolution 2254 will lead to a lasting peace guaranteeing respect for the human rights of all people. It is essential that we finally achieve a negotiated, viable and lasting political solution. We call on all of the parties to the conflict and parties or powers that have an influence to work to this end, in particular in continuing negotiations under the aegis of the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Thank you, President. My delegation reaffirms its support to the search for a peaceful negotiated solution to the conflict in the Syrian Arab Republic. We fully trust in the capacity of the people and the authorities of Syria to reach that goal. The political solution to the conflict will hinge on full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria, bearing in mind the genuine interests and aspirations of its people, and ceasing interventionist, destabilizing actions and fostering cooperation with that country's authorities. The international community must contribute to this goal, setting aside double standards, selectivity and politicization in addressing the issue of the human rights situation in Syria and indeed in any other country. These negative practices that are only used against developing countries, sometimes with the use of unilateral coercive measures, exacerbate political conflict and do nothing to improve the human rights situation on the ground. President, the issue of human rights in Syria has been examined for several years now, both within the Third Committee and within the Human Rights Council, with a degree of deep political bias. This seems to lead to singling out Syria. It certainly seems to serve that goal. Cuba believes that the appropriate functions of the various bodies should be dealt with so as to address the issue of human rights in a non-discriminatory and balanced way. My delegation cannot accept an approach that would make the GA the platform to amplify the selectivity and political bias used against Syria that could be used in the future against any other developing country. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for organizing this panel. Thank you, panelists, for your deeply personal stories, your harrowing stories, and stories that deserve to be heard, certainly also here in the General Assembly, because we need to remain aware of the misery that has unfolded in Syria over the last 10 years. In the same vein, we thank the Commission of Inquiry for their work, for their reports, for yet again documenting the widespread and systematic violation of human rights in Syria, in particular by the Assad regime. In the past 10 years, horrific crimes have been committed against the Syrian population. Large numbers of Syrians have been tortured, murdered, forcibly disappeared, subjected to poison gas attacks, or have lost everything in fleeing for their lives. Many spoke of accountability today, and accountability is one of the top priorities of Dutch foreign policy, making sure that massive violations of human rights are not forgotten and that the perpetrators will face justice. This is not a matter of bias, this is a matter of justice. The victims of the horrific crimes committed by the Assad regime deserve justice, and after 10 years, action is needed, more than ever. Efforts to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court have failed, and this is why the Netherlands decided to hold the Syrian regime to account for human rights violations, specifically torture, under the UN Convention Against Torture. We have reminded Syria of its international obligations and urged them to cease the violations and enable victims to effectuate their rights. A lasting political solution in Syria is only possible when victims obtain justice. We therefore call on everyone to further strengthen different accountability efforts, for instance through support for our step to hold Syria to account, but also by supporting the Commission of Inquiry, the IIIM, and Syrian civil society. It is essential to continuously work towards justice for the victims and jointly fight impunity. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Netherlands. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the panelists for their presentations. The conflict in Syria has reached its 10th grim anniversary, a decade marked by death, displacement, and destruction. 10 years on, and we remain appalled by the magnitude and the scale of human rights violations committed by all parties to the conflict. Brazil reiterates its condemnations to the indiscriminate attacks against civilians, the targeting of medical and humanitarian workers, and the enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, and summary killings that have become all too common throughout the conflict. This dire human rights situation is worsened by the spread of the pandemic and its effect on the socio-economic rights of the Syrian population. Given this reality, it's imperative that the humanitarian exemptions for any sanctions program related to Syria be closely followed in order to ensure that they don't undermine access to food and essential health supplies, especially in the light of the spread of COVID-19. The continued suffering of the Syrian population makes it even more justifiable that parts continue to be supplied with the means to wage war, and that refugees sorry, I will read again. The continued suffering of the Syrian population makes it even more unjustifiable that parties continue to be supplied with the means to wage war. The refugees in need of protection are turned away, and that countries refuse to repatriate their own nationals, including children, choosing instead to leave them in overcrowded IDP camps. After a decade of conflict, the political solution so urgently needed continued to be stalled, paralyzed by the divisions within the Constitutional Committee. With foreign soldiers fighting in the country, this never-ending crisis is also a result of insufficient commitment from the international community. Brazil reaffirms its support to the efforts of the Special Envoy, Geir Pedersen, in facilitating a solution to the conflict through the implementation of Resolution 2254, and urges the parties involved to engage seriously in the process. We remain convinced that only a Syrian-owned and Syrian-led, UN-facilitated political process with due regard for the preservation of Syria's territorial integrity will bring lasting peace and provide relief for the suffering of the Syrian population. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, President. I'd like to begin by expressing our bewilderment at the idea of organising today's informal GA meeting. As is well known, the basis for it is a politicised, non-consensus-based resolution of the Third Committee, 74/169, Situation of Human Rights in the Syrian Arab Republic. Its content has very little to do with reality. The whole resolution is built on unverified accusations, lies and conjecture. It's shamelessly used by opponents of the Syrian government. The only aim of this resolution is to punish the Syrian leadership, whose independent course doesn't suit a number of Western countries who continue to promote practices of using force or the threat of force in international relations. At the heart, this is an erroneous approach that is also continued in the speeches of a number of our colleagues today. The Russian Federation has repeatedly called for that we not use human rights discourse to resolve short-term political aims, and also that we stop violating the UN Charter in applying pressure to sovereign states within the UN and threatening them, but rather return to mutually respectful dialogue and constructive cooperation. It's a pity that neither the panelists nor some of those who talk of defending human rights didn't talk about the real problems that Syria and its government have been dealing with. For a number of years, the Syrian Arab Republic has been fighting against terrorist groups financed from outside. The most difficult situation is to be found in Idlib, where there are still international terrorists at work. The second problem is the violation of sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the state, and the illegal occupation of its territory by the United States and the violation of its natural resources. There's also the issue of women and children who are in refugee camps controlled by the United States that has a responsibility for them as the occupying force. The people of Syria for a long time have been victims of unilateral illegal sanctions, which are destroying not only the economic and social rights of Syrians, but also leading to the humanitarian catastrophe. They're depriving the people of the hope of economic recovery, in particular during the COVID pandemic. Against this background, the rhetoric of Western countries saying that there is no alternative to cross-border humanitarian assistance looks simply cynical. What was also mentioned today was the mechanism to investigate so-called crimes in Syria. It's illegal in its foundation and its functioning, and that's clear to any sensible delegation. This question has nothing to do with human rights. President, I won't comment on what was said by the German ambassador because they don't have anything to do with the General Assembly meeting. Today's meeting has nothing to do with international cooperation in the promotion and protection of human rights. Accordingly, the discussion imposed on us cannot help stabilize the situation in Syria or international efforts to find a settlement in that country. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The DPRK delegation would like to take this opportunity to reaffirm its objection and rejection to all country-specific mandates, as they are the typical example of politicization, selectivity, and double standards of human rights. Those country-specific mandates and mechanisms have nothing to do with the promotion and protection of human rights, but only cause confrontation with pressure and interference in other countries' internal affairs, as well as hinder and impair the constructive dialogue and cooperation in the fields of human rights. Today, some Western countries have become more undisguised in their attempt to use the country-specific human rights mechanisms as a main politicized tool aimed at violating national sovereignty and overthrowing other legitimate governments, including the Syrian Arab Republic. It is a clear violation to the principle and purpose of the UN Charter and other international human rights laws. We have the UPR mechanism of the Human Rights Council, where human rights situations of all countries are considered on an equal and impartial basis. We reiterate that the work of the human rights in the United Nations should be conducted in an objective, transparent, non-selective, non-confrontational, and non-politicized manner. In conclusion, my delegation extends a constant support and solidarity to the government and people of the Syrian Arab Republic in their struggle to defend its sovereignty and genuine human rights of their people, and once again strongly rejects the impure attempts and movements to politicize the human rights on the international arena. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Now I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, in line with its historic position of principle, strongly rejects once again the manipulation of the human rights issue for political aims, as well as the adoption of resolutions and mechanisms that do not have the consent of the states concerned. This is a flagrant violation of the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, and far from contributing to promoting and protecting human rights, it brings about a climate of mistrust which contributes in no way to the international efforts in this important domain. In this regard, the convening of an informal meeting of this important body to address an alleged human rights situation in a member state on the basis of a resolution that was not adopted by consensus and that which does not have the consent of the country concerned is simply another example of the political manipulation of this General Assembly to attack a member state, and also the United Nations and all that it represents, particularly the achievement of channels for dialogue to address common challenges and threats. This meeting is therefore very far from meeting the principles of cooperation, constructive dialogue, universality, impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity, non-confrontation, and non-politicization that should govern the approach to human rights. Unfortunately, we're once again seeing the attempt to build a polarizing narrative of good and evil, in which the real promoters of war and major arms producers attempt to paint themselves as major allies of human rights and democracy by making speeches replete with moral exhortations and lectures, when paradoxically they are the promoters of human rights violations en masse through acts of aggression, exacerbating racial and religious tensions as a result of geopolitical interests, and financing extremist and terrorist groups, and economically asphyxiation through the illegal use of criminal unilateral coercive measures against those who they consider to be their ideological enemies, simply because they have chosen a path of independence, autonomy, and sovereignty, even at the expense of pain and suffering that the aforementioned cruel policies bring about deliberately for all of the civilian population without any exception. President, Venezuela acknowledges the efforts made by the Syrian Arab Republic to consolidate its internal stability and to maintain its national unity, together with different international actors, including the United Nations. While we recognize the progress made in terms of guaranteeing and promoting and protecting human rights for its people, even in the midst of the ferocious attempts at foreign armed intervention and the proliferation of terrorist groups as a result of this cruel war. Finally, we stress that the only and the best way to address and uphold human rights would mean that all international stakeholders would promote transparent dialogue with states and not set up mechanisms without their consents. And in this particular case as well, to get rid of all unilateral coercive measures that attack the human rights of the heroic Syrian people and which are an obstacle to the achievement of development and peace. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Estonia, while repeating my request that the statements should be concise and not more than 3 minutes. We have 6 speakers and 12 minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. President. Estonia aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union and offers the following additional remarks in its national capacity. We welcome today's General Assembly meeting and the presentations, as well as the tireless work by the members of the Commission of Inquiry and civil society with us today. These testimonies and the evidence collected reflect a decade-long conflict bringing violence and immense suffering. We condemn the persistent, systematic and widespread gross violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law by all parties to the conflict, in particular by the Syrian regime and its allies. These have hit hardest the most vulnerable of the society. Women and girls have been disproportionately affected throughout Syria. Millions of children have been deprived of childhood care, protection and education. Grave violations against children have continued. Without accountability and justice, there can be no peace. We stand by all steps to ensure that those responsible for breaches of international humanitarian law and human rights law, some of which may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity, are held accountable. These include the referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court, as well as the use of universal jurisdiction. We continue to support the work of the IIIM and Commission of Inquiry. Estonia also reiterates the need for safe, full and unhindered humanitarian access to all parts of Syria, in line with humanitarian principles. All channels of delivering life-saving aid should be made available. We call upon the Syrian regime to cease all restrictions on the delivery of humanitarian aid and to stop the harassment of humanitarian workers. Unfortunately, cross-line aid deliveries have remained irregular and unreliable, which underscores the need to ensure the continuation and broadening of the cross-border aid mechanism. There can be no military solution in Syria. We call for an immediate nationwide ceasefire throughout Syria to guarantee the protection of civilians. We reiterate the position of the European Union that assistance in the reconstruction of Syria can only commence when a genuine and inclusive political transition in line with Security Council Resolution 2254 is firmly underway. The same applies for the removal of sanctions imposed by the EU on the Syrian leadership. The aim of these is to give a clear signal that punitive war tactics such as targeting hospitals, torture of political prisoners, and enforced disappearances will not be dismissed as something normal. At the same time, the sanctions are designed to avoid impeding the supply of humanitarian assistance. In closing, we underline the continued need for the UN, including its human rights bodies, to stay engaged with the situation in Syria. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Estonia. Now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Merci.
Thank you, President. Belgium fully aligns itself with the statement delivered by the EU. I would like to thank you for convening this debate, and I'd like to thank the panelists, and in particular I'd like to thank the representative of civil society, whose account was particularly moving. The latest reports of the International Commission of Inquiry on Syria remind us that the most basic rights of millions of Syrians, in particular children, continue to be violated, and that 1 million Syrians still depend on humanitarian aid. Over the last 10 years, the parties to the conflict have, on many occasions, violated international law and international human rights. Some of these acts may be considered to be crimes against humanity and war crimes, and they may constitute genocide. The conflict has left a country in ruins. Human rights violations that have occurred over the last decade, the horror as a result of them is clear, and on a daily basis the people are suffering from torture, kidnappings, as well as chemical attacks. This list, unfortunately, is interminable. In no case can there be lasting peace without justice for the victims. Those responsible must be held accountable, and that is why we support the conclusions of the Commission of Inquiry and the work of the IIIM. The COI, since it was set up, has worked tirelessly and done crucial work, and I would like here to pay tribute to them on behalf of Belgium. I would also like to welcome the initiatives in terms of justice at the national and international levels that have sought to avoid impunity. We have always called out human violations, and we have tried to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people. The cross-border mechanism is crucial in this regard. The provision of humanitarian aid, including vaccines and medical assistance, needs to be safe, lasting, and unhindered, and this must be assured for the UN and humanitarian personnel so that those in need in Syria can receive assistance throughout the Syrian Arab Republic. However, we must also focus on the urgent goal of bringing about peace. There is no military solution to the crisis. The only possible solution is a political one. President, the Syrian regime must, without delay, commit to a political process and fully implement Resolution 2254 of the UN Security Council. Finally, we fully support the Brussels V conference that will be held on the 30th of March. It aims to mobilize political and financial support at the international level to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people. The European Union, with its members, will shoulder its responsibility as the primary donor to Syria. Thank you.
Distinguished representative of Belgium, now give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank you for organizing this important discussion on the situation in Syria. I would also thank the 6 panelists and civil society and the moderator, ASG for Human Rights. The latest report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, in addition to highlighting the human rights violations perpetrated by the parties to the conflict, points to the internationalization of the conflict due to involvement of influential states. The conflict in Syria is primarily political in nature. The fact that the conflict has been so protracted and intractable points to the inevitability of a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process, preserving the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Syria, in line with Council Resolution 2254, and culminating in constitutional reform and free and fair elections. We call on all parties to the conflict to show political will and statesmanship to break the current impasse on the political track. The 10-year-long Syrian conflict has brought about much suffering to the Syrian people. The country is facing a dire situation compounded by COVID-19, winterization, and food insecurity, which is putting into peril the future of 17 million Syrians. The scale, severity, and complexity of humanitarian needs should provoke the collective conscience of the international community, particularly those who advocate linking of humanitarian and developmental assistance to expected outcomes on the political track. We appeal for an assessment of sanctions measures on Syria, since they are considerably aggravating the current situation faced by the people, especially women, children, and the elderly. The protection of civilian life is paramount, and the blatant disregard for civilian safety runs contrary to the obligations that all parties must uphold under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The involvement of external actors in Syria has given a fillip to the growth of terrorism in Syria and in the region. The presence of 11,000 ISIL fighters in northeast and reports of radicalization, training, incitement in camps housing ISIL fighters is a matter of serious concern. It is imperative that all parties must adhere to their international obligations to fight terrorism and terrorist organizations in Syria. In conclusion, Mr. President, India continues to stand with the people of Syria in this grave hour of need, and we are ready to continue to render all possible help and support to the Syrian people.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. Now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Our delegation has listened carefully to the statements made, and we once again reject the fact that this body is focusing on allowing some member states to move forward their agendas, and this violates the principles of objectivity and non-selectivity. Progress made in the domain of human rights in Syria has been ignored. My delegation voted against this politicized resolution, and we wish to reiterate our position with regard to the human rights situation on specific countries. This is a practice that politicizes human rights. We reaffirm our full solidarity with the people and government of the Syrian Arab Republic, and it's important for nations to respect what is laid down in international law and the UN Charter, that is to say, to accept the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of peoples who wish to live in harmony. We reiterate that the only solution to the crisis is through negotiation, dialogue and consensus. There is no military solution to the conflict, and multilateralism and respect for international standards must be ensured. We must ensure non-interference in states' internal affairs without any foreign intervention and without any pressure being brought to bear on states. And we certainly shouldn't politicize the human rights situation or humanitarian situation of states. Unilateral actions only exacerbate the situation. We reaffirm our full support to the initiatives for dialogue and negotiation to lead to peace, unity and cooperation in Syria, as well as in the wider Middle East and anywhere in the world where there is war. We must step up in efforts at the national, regional and international level to support efforts to end the crisis in Syria and to ensure that the country can live in peace. Thank you.
Thank the distinguished representative of Nicaragua. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, the Syrian Arab Republic is indeed in a complex situation. As this country has survived the scourge of a destructive war, it also continues to severely suffer from external intervention, foreign occupation, and attacks from terrorist groups and foreign forces, including the Israeli regime, which has already occupied the Syrian Golan in gross violation of international law. While the majority of the Syrian population are in desperate need of humanitarian assistance, Syria is subject to unilateral economic sanctions and still some parts of the country are under foreign occupation or under the control of terrorists. In such a complex situation, addressing the human rights issue in one country, here Syria, is not an easy task, and we all have the responsibility and duty to ensure that human rights are not abused in order to achieve narrow political interests. In this regard, it is unacceptable to allow the misuse of UN premises to target member states, including Syria. This kind of action is far removed from the reality that is faced, does not adequately address the complexities of the situation, and does not serve as a means of protection nor promotion of human rights. Mr. President, in fact, in addition to terrorists, the main threat to the Syrian people is sanctions that target the most vulnerable the most and violate their basic human rights. Therefore, one of the urgent measures that must be taken for the actual protection of human rights of the Syrian people is the full and immediate removal of all sanctions. As a means of collective punishment of an entire population, sanctions are unlawful and inhuman and must come to an end. Simultaneously, political process for the resolution of conflict must be supported. In this context, we underline the important role played by the Astana format to advance the political process, including the establishment of the Constitutional Committee. The Astana format has also greatly contributed to the escalation of conflict, protection of civilians, and ensuring delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people in need. Establishment of the de-escalation zones succeeded in reducing levels of violence and could introduce new dynamics affecting developments on the ground. Hence, while ensuring that terrorists do not have a safe haven anywhere, all shall remain within the realm of the current ongoing international affairs and strictly avoid any actions that might jeopardize the political settlement. Any solution to the conflict in Syria should respect the national unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the country within its internationally recognized borders. Syrian crisis can end only through a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, and UN-facilitated political process. This can restore peace and security in Syria and pave the way for better protection and promotion of human rights in this multicultural and civilized nation. In this regard, the Islamic Republic of Iran will continue not only its constructive engagement to return tranquility to Syria, but also remains ready for further cooperation to facilitate the humanitarian assistance on the ground. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the last speaker, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, China has always stood for constructive dialogue and cooperation on the basis of equality and mutual respect to promote and protect human rights and appropriately address differences. China opposes politicization, selectivity, double standards, and confrontational approach, and opposes country-specific resolutions on human rights. GA Resolution 74/169 on situation in Syria was adopted by a vote, and China voted against it. That's why China does not endorse convening this informal meeting today pursuant to that resolution. The Syrian crisis has dragged on for many years. The Syrian people have suffered deeply from the scourge of war, and their most basic human rights, including rights to subsistence and development and health, are not guaranteed. The pressing task now is to seek an early political solution to the Syrian crisis and give the Syrian people a peaceful and tranquil living environment with special attention to protecting women, children, and other vulnerable groups. The human rights situation in Syria is affected by both natural and man-made disasters. The factors such as the COVID-19 pandemic and natural disasters have further exacerbated the humanitarian situation in Syria. The unilateral coercive measures, illegal blockade, and other man-made factors have gravely undermined the ability. And the man-made disasters. Alina Dohan, the special rapporteur, last December, that it believed that the unilateral announced that the unilateral coercive measures are major obstacle to the economic development, reconstruction, and severely hinder the Syrian people's access to essential medical supplies and services, and making the humanitarian situation in Syria much worse. If countries like Germany really cares about the humanitarian needs in Syria, they should support, without any condition, the removal of unilateral coercive measures and stop the politicization of the humanitarian issues. Stop using it instead of pointing, dictating, and accusing finger at China and other countries for their voting position at the Security Council. In conclusion, China urges the countries concerned to lift the unilateral coercive measures against Syria in response to the calls by the Secretary General and the Special Rapporteur. Thank you. To protect Syrian people's right to subsistence and development. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. We have heard the last speaker. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I thank the distinguished panelists for their participation in this high-level panel on the situation of human rights in Syria. This situation in Syria requires the full attention of the United Nations, including human rights bodies, accountability mechanisms, the Security Council, and here in the General Assembly. The violations of international humanitarian law and abuses of human rights, including those that may amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes, have, over the course of 10 years, torn apart the fabric of society in Syria. I trust that, in line with existing resolutions and the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations, member states will continue to support improvement of the human rights situation in Syria, improved humanitarian access, the call for an immediate and nationwide ceasefire, and support for a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned political settlement in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2254 and the UN's efforts in this regard. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the Syrian people need the United Nations, and we must answer their call for help. I thank you. I thank the delegations for their participation. The high-level panel discussion is now concluded. Before adjourning the meeting, I would also like to call the attention of the members to the letter circulated on 26th of February 2021, which has information regarding the occupational safety and health plan for this meeting, including in the possibility of follow-up in the unfortunate and hopefully unlikely event of a case of COVID-19. Following the arrangements in recent meetings, the Secretariat will actively manage the exit by calling each row for departure in a staggered manner. Members are therefore requested to remain seated after the adjournment of the meeting. The meeting is adjourned.
Distinguished delegates, I would now kindly request that you leave the GA hall according to the following staggered plan. First, I call on the delegates seated in the first row from Iceland to Italy, please. May I kindly request that you leave the hall one by one?